Harry Potter pressed his small body against the cold wooden door of the cupboard under the stairs, listening to the thunderous footsteps above his head. Uncle Vernon was pacing again, which meant trouble. The floorboards creaked in that particular rhythm that Harry had learned to recognize over his 8 years of life, a pattern that usually preceded one of Vernon's explosive rages. The boy's stomach gnawed at itself with familiar hunger. He had been given only a single piece of dry toast that morning, punishment for accidentally burning the bacon the day before. The scorch marks on his small hands had barely begun to heal, but Uncle Vernon had declared that freaks who couldn't control themselves didn't deserve proper meals. Harry had learned not to argue. Arguments only made things worse. Through the thin walls, he could hear Aunt Petunia's sharp voice cutting through the afternoon air like a blade. She was talking to Mrs. Henderson from next door, probably complaining about something Harry had supposedly done wrong. Everything was always Harry's fault in the Dursley household. If the milk went sour, if the television reception was poor, if Dudley had a bad day at school, somehow it all traced back to the scrawny boy locked beneath the stairs. Harry shifted carefully, trying to find a position that didn't press against one of his bruises. Vernon had grabbed him particularly hard the night before, fingers digging into his upper arms until Harry was certain the bones might snap. The man's face had been purple with rage, spittle flying as he screamed about freaks and abnormalities, and how Harry was nothing but a burden on their generous family. The word generous would have been laughable if Harry had dared to laugh. He wore Dudley's cast-off clothes, so large they hung on his malnourished frame, like bed-sheets on a scarecrow. His shoes were held together with tape, his glasses were cracked from Dudley's favourite game of Harry hunting, and his hair had been cut so short and unevenly that bald patches showed on his scalp. Generous was not a word that applied to anything in Harry's experience. A door slammed upstairs, rattling the very foundations of the house. Harry flinched instinctively, his body preparing for whatever punishment was coming. He had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense Uncle Vernon's moods, a survival skill born of necessity. The heavy footsteps were moving toward the stairs now, each step deliberate and ominous. But instead of stopping at the cupboard door, the footsteps continued past. Harry heard the front door open and Uncle Vernon's booming voice as he spoke to someone outside. The conversation was muffled, but Harry caught fragments that made his blood run cold. Residential facility. Problem children. Permanent solution. Harry's breathing became shallow and rapid. He had heard Uncle Vernon on the telephone the week before, talking to someone about places that handled difficult kids, children who were beyond normal help. The conversation had been cut short when Aunt Petunia noticed Harry listening from the kitchen doorway, but the threat had lingered in the air like smoke. The front door slammed shut again, and Uncle Vernon's footsteps returned with renewed purpose. This time they stopped directly outside the cupboard door. Harry pressed himself against the far wall, making himself as small as possible, but there was nowhere to hide in the cramped space that had served as his bedroom for as long as he could remember. The door was yanked open, and Uncle Vernon's massive bulk filled the doorway. His face was flushed with excitement rather than anger, which somehow made him more terrifying. When Uncle Vernon was excited about something involving Harry, it was never good news. "You little freak," Uncle Vernon said, his voice carrying a satisfaction that made Harry's skin crawl. "We've found the perfect place for you, somewhere they know how to handle abnormal children like you." Harry tried to speak, to ask what was happening, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. Uncle Vernon's hand shot out, grabbing Harry by the front of his oversized shirt and hauling him out of the cupboard. The boy's feet barely touched the ground as he was dragged toward the living room, where Aunt Petunia sat with a stack of official-looking papers spread across the coffee table. She looked up as they entered, her horse-like face showing the same excited anticipation as her husband. Her thin lips were curved in what might have been called a smile on anyone else, but on Petunia Dursley it looked more like a grimace of triumph. "The Thornfield Institute for Troubled Youth," she announced, tapping one of the papers with a manicured fingernail. "They specialize in children with behavioral problems and unusual circumstances. They assured us they have experience with cases like Harry's. Harry felt something cold settle in the pit of his stomach. He had never heard of the Thornfield Institute, but the way his aunt and uncle spoke about it made him think of horror stories, of places where unwanted children disappeared forever. His mind raced, trying to understand what unusual circumstances meant in his case, but he was afraid to ask. "They have a van coming tomorrow morning," Uncle Vernon continued, his grip on Harry's shirt tightening. "You'll be their problem after that. No more freaky accidents, no more embarrassing explanations to the neighbours, no more wasted food on an ungrateful little burden." The words hit Harry like physical blows. He had always known the Dursleys didn't want him, but hearing it stated so plainly was devastating. More than that, the mention of freaky accidents made his stomach lurch with fear. They knew, they had always known that the strange things that happened around him weren't normal, and now they were going to send him away because of it. Harry's vision blurred, whether from tears or panic he couldn't tell. The room seemed to spin around him, and he felt that familiar sensation building in his chest, the one that preceded the accidents Uncle Vernon had mentioned. It was like electricity running through his veins, wild and uncontrollable. "No," he whispered, the word barely audible. "Please, I'll be better. I'll be good." Uncle Vernon's laugh was harsh and humorless. "You'll never be good, boy. You're fundamentally broken, just like your freak parents. At least at Thornfield, you'll be someone else's problem." The mention of his parents was like a match to kindling. Harry felt the electric sensation surge through his body with unprecedented intensity. The lights in the living room began to flicker, and Aunt Petunia's teacup rattled against its saucer on the side table. "Stop that!" Uncle Vernon roared, shaking Harry roughly. "Stop it right now!" But Harry couldn't stop it. The power was beyond his control, fed by fear and desperation, and 8 years of accumulated rage. The television screen crackled with static, and somewhere in the kitchen, dishes began to clatter in their cupboards. Petunia shrieked as sparks began to dance along the electrical outlets, and Uncle Vernon's face went from red to purple. He raised his free hand as if to strike Harry, but before the blow could fall, every light bulb in the house exploded simultaneously. In the darkness that followed, Harry heard Uncle Vernon curse and stumble backward. The grip on his shirt loosened, and suddenly Harry was free. Without thinking, acting purely on instinct, he ran for the front door. His hands shook as he fumbled with the locks, Uncle Vernon's angry shouts growing louder behind him. The door finally opened, and Harry burst out into the late afternoon sunlight, running as fast as his thin legs could carry him. He had no destination in mind, no plan beyond getting as far away from Privet Drive as possible. His bare feet slapped against the pavement as he ran through the suburban streets, past neat gardens and identical houses where normal families lived normal lives. Behind him, he could hear Uncle Vernon shouting his name, but the sound grew fainter with each step. Harry ran until his lungs burned and his legs trembled with exhaustion. When he finally stopped, he found himself in the little whinging shopping district, several miles from Privet Drive. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows between the shops and businesses that made up the small commercial area. The boy looked around desperately, searching for somewhere to hide. His entire body was shaking now, from exhaustion, fear, and the aftermath of whatever had happened back at the house. He had never made the lights explode before. Usually the strange incidents were smaller, more contained. This had been different, more violent, and it terrified him almost as much as the thought of the Thornfield Institute. A narrow alley between a grocery store and a dry cleaner caught his attention. It looked dark and secluded, the kind of place where a small boy might hide until he figured out what to do next. Harry stumbled toward it, his vision starting to blur with exhaustion and the shock of what had just happened. He had made it halfway down the alley when his legs finally gave out. He collapsed against a pile of cardboard boxes behind the grocery store, his small body curling up instinctively, as he had learned to do during Uncle Vernon's worst rages. The boxes smelled of rotting vegetables and discarded packaging, but they provided some shelter from the wind that was picking up as evening approached. Harry closed his eyes and tried to think. He had nowhere to go, no one who would help him. The Dursleys had made sure he had no friends, no connections outside their house. He didn't even know if he had any other relatives who might take him in. Uncle Vernon had always said that Harry's parents had been drunks and criminals with no family worth knowing. The thought of his parents brought a fresh wave of grief. He had so few memories of them, just fragments of warmth and love that felt more like dreams than actual recollections. Sometimes he wondered if he had imagined them entirely, if the accident Uncle Vernon described had robbed him of parents who had never really cared about him at all. But no, that couldn't be right. Somewhere deep inside, Harry knew his parents had loved him. He could feel it in the rare moments when the strange incidents happened, as if some part of them was still with him, still trying to protect him. The thought gave him a small measure of comfort as he huddled behind the cardboard boxes. Time seemed to move strangely as Harry drifted in and out of consciousness. The sun had fully set by the time he heard footsteps approaching the mouth of the alley. He pressed himself deeper into the shadows, hoping whoever it was would pass by without noticing him. But the footsteps stopped, and a gentle voice called out into the darkness. "Is someone there?" "It's all right, I'm not going to hurt you." Harry remained perfectly still, barely breathing. The voice sounded like a woman, older but not unkind. After his experience with the Dursleys, Harry had learned that adult voices could be deceptive, that kindness could be a mask for cruelty. "I can see you there, dear," the voice continued. "You look like you might need some help." A flashlight beam swept across the alley, and Harry knew he had been spotted. He looked up to see a woman in a blue uniform standing at the entrance to the alley. She was shorter than Aunt Petunia, with greying brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. The woman took a step closer, moving slowly and deliberately, as if approaching a frightened animal. Her uniform bore a badge that Harry couldn't read in the dim light, but something about her manner suggested authority without threat. "My name is P.C. Whitman," she said, crouching down so she was closer to Harry's eye level. "I'm a police constable. Can you tell me your name?" Harry's throat was so dry he could barely speak, but he managed to whisper his name. "P. Harthorpe." Whitman's expression grew concerned as she took in his appearance. Even in the poor light of the alley, Harry knew he must look terrible. His clothes were dirty and torn from his flight through the streets, his face was streaked with tears and grime, and his small body probably showed clear signs of malnutrition. "Harry," P.C. Whitman said gently. "How old are you?" "8," Harry replied, his voice barely audible. The police constable's expression darkened slightly, though her tone remained carefully neutral. "Are you hurt, Harry? Do you need medical attention?" Harry wasn't sure how to answer that question. He was always hurt in some way or another, whether from Uncle Vernon's rough handling, Aunt Petunia's casual cruelty, or simply the constant ache of hunger and neglect. But he had learned to hide pain, to pretend everything was fine, even when it wasn't. "I'm okay," he lied, the words automatic after years of practice. P.C. Whitman studied his face carefully, and Harry had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see right through his deception. Her next words confirmed his suspicion. "Harry, I need to ask you some questions, and I want you to know that you're not in trouble. But I need you to be honest with me, all right? Where do you live?" The question hit Harry like a physical blow. Where did he live? Privet Drive had never felt like home, just a place where he was unwanted and afraid. But it was the only address he knew, the only place he had ever been allowed to exist. "For Privet Drive," he said quietly. P.C. Whitman made a note in a small pad she had pulled from her pocket. "And who do you live with there?" "My aunt and uncle. The Dursleys." Something in the way Harry said the name made P.C. Whitman look up sharply. There was a wealth of fear and pain in those simple words, emotions that no 8-year-old should associate with the people who were supposed to care for him. "Harry," P.C. Whitman said carefully, "why aren't you at home right now?" It's getting late, and I imagine your aunt and uncle are worried about you." The laugh that escaped Harry's lips was bitter and hollow, far too old for his young face. "They're not worried," he said. "They're probably celebrating." The police constable's pen stopped moving across her notepad. She looked at Harry with the focused attention of someone who had dealt with enough troubled children to recognize the signs of serious abuse. "Can you tell me why you think that, Harry?" And suddenly, as if a dam had burst inside him, the words began pouring out. Harry found himself telling P.C. Whitman about the cupboard under the stairs, about the meals he was denied, about Uncle Vernon's violent rages and Aunt Petunia's cold cruelty. He told her about the strange accidents that happened when he was upset or afraid, and how the Dursleys had decided to send him away to a place for troubled children. P.C. Whitman listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly grim as Harry's story unfolded. When he finished, she closed her notepad and looked at him with a mixture of professional concern and personal outrage that Harry found both comforting and terrifying. "Harry," she said firmly, "I need to take you to the hospital to make sure you're not seriously hurt. After that, we're going to have a very serious conversation with some people who can help you. What's happening to you is not okay, and it's not your fault. Do you understand me?" Harry nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed her. In his experience, adults said a lot of things they didn't mean, and help was often just another word for more trouble. But there was something in P.C. Whitman's manner that made him want to trust her, even though trust was a luxury he had learned he couldn't afford. As P.C. Whitman helped him to his feet and guided him toward the mouth of the alley, Harry caught sight of a familiar figure watching from across the street. Mrs. Arabella Figg stood in the shadow of a shop doorway, her cat-lady appearance unchanged, but her expression troubled. When she saw Harry looking at her, she raised one hand in a small, sad wave, then melted back into the shadows. Harry wondered why Mrs. Figg looked so sad, why she didn't come over to help or at least to say hello. He had always gotten the impression that she knew more about his situation than she let on, but she had never intervened before. Tonight seemed no different, despite the obvious crisis. The police car was warm and clean, a stark contrast to the cold cupboard Harry was used to. P.C. Whitman made sure he was safely buckled in before getting behind the wheel, her movements efficient but gentle. As they drove through the darkened streets of Little Whinging, Harry found himself wondering if this was what safety felt like. The hospital was bright and busy, full of people in white coats who moved with purpose and authority. Harry had never been in a hospital before, and the unfamiliar sights and sounds made him nervous. But P.C. Whitman stayed close by his side, her presence a calming influence as they navigated the maze of corridors and waiting rooms. A doctor with kind eyes and gentle hands examined Harry thoroughly, documenting each bruise, each sign of malnutrition, each indication of long-term neglect and abuse. Harry tried to be brave during the examination, but some of the bruises were still tender, and he couldn't help flinching when they were touched. The doctor's questions were careful and professional, but Harry could see the anger building in her expression as she catalogued the evidence of his mistreatment. When she was finished, she spoke quietly to P.C. Whitman in the hallway outside Harry's room, their voices too low for him to hear, but their body language conveying urgency and concern. Harry lay in the hospital bed, clean and fed for the first time in longer than he could remember, and tried to process what was happening to him. For 8 years, he had accepted his life with the Dursleys as normal, as what he deserved. But P.C. Whitman's reaction, the doctor's obvious distress, and the careful way everyone was treating him suggested that maybe his normal wasn't normal at all. Maybe, Harry thought as exhaustion finally claimed him, maybe there was a chance for something better. Maybe the strange accidents that had always brought him trouble might actually turn out to be his salvation. As sleep overtook him, Harry Potter allowed himself to hope for the first time in his short, difficult life. Outside his room, P.C. Whitman was making phone calls and filling out reports, setting in motion a chain of events that would ultimately reshape not just Harry's world, but the hidden magical society that had failed him so completely. The investigation that would change everything had officially begun. The Gothic towers and ancient stone walls of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry had witnessed centuries of magical education, but the revolutionary changes implemented following the Potter reforms represented the most comprehensive transformation in the institution's long history. The castle that had once operated in complete isolation from the Muggle world now hosted the first integrated Magical Muggle Child Welfare Oversight Committee, with representatives from both communities working together to ensure that no student would ever again be abandoned to institutional neglect or abuse. Minerva McGonagall stood in the renovated Great Hall, her tartan robes a stark contrast to the modern presentation equipment that now coexisted with the floating candles and enchanted ceiling that had always defined the space. Her elevation to headmistress following Dumbledore's conviction had been unanimously supported by both the Board of Governors and the newly established Joint Oversight Commission, recognizing her decades of dedication to student welfare and her consistent opposition to policies that prioritized institutional interests over individual needs. The transformation in McGonagall herself reflected the profound changes that accountability and transparency had brought to magical education. Her natural sternness had been tempered by a new openness to innovation and collaboration, while her protective instincts towards students had been enhanced by access to resources and support systems that previous generations of educators could never have imagined. The morning briefing included representatives from multiple organizations that had emerged from the original Potter investigation, each contributing expertise that helped create the comprehensive support network now available to magical students from all backgrounds. The integration of perspectives from magical and Muggle child welfare specialists had produced educational policies that addressed the complete range of challenges facing young witches and wizards in an increasingly complex world. Dr. Elizabeth Chen took her place at the conference table with the confidence of someone whose medical expertise had become essential to the proper care of magical children. Her role as Director of Magical Medical Integration at Hogwarts represented one of the most successful aspects of the reform movement, with her trauma-informed approaches to healthcare having dramatically improved outcomes for students dealing with everything from homesickness to serious psychological disorders. The medical transformation at Hogwarts had been comprehensive, replacing the traditional approach of treating magical ailments in isolation with integrated care that recognized the complex interactions between magical, physical, and psychological health. The new medical wing included both magical healers and Muggle-trained medical professionals, ensuring that students received care that addressed all aspects of their well-being. Pomona Sprout occupied her usual position as head of Hufflepuff House, but her role had expanded to include oversight of the new student advocate program that gave young people a voice in the policies that affected their daily lives. Her natural compassion and patience had made her an ideal coordinator for initiatives that encouraged students to speak up about problems rather than suffering in silence, as previous generations had been expected to do. The house system itself had undergone significant reforms, with the traditional competitive elements balanced by collaborative programs that emphasized cooperation between houses and year groups. The changes had been designed to address the isolation and bullying that had characterized many students' experiences under the previous system, creating a more inclusive environment where academic and personal success were measured by individual growth rather than comparative achievement. Phileas Flitwick entered the hall with his characteristic cheerfulness, enhanced by genuine excitement about the educational innovations that had emerged from the integration process. His collaboration with Muggle educators had produced breakthrough developments in magical instruction that helped students understand not just how to perform magic, but why their abilities worked and how they connected to both magical and scientific principles of the natural world. The curriculum reforms had been among the most visible changes at Hogwarts, with traditional magical subjects expanded to include perspectives from Muggle science, psychology, and social studies. The integrated approach had produced graduates who were better prepared to navigate both worlds, understanding their magical heritage while maintaining connections to the broader human community. Severus Snape's presence at the oversight meeting reflected his transformation from reluctant double agent to committed advocate for student welfare, his experiences during the Potter investigation having forced him to confront the ways his own trauma had affected his teaching methods. His collaboration with Muggle chemistry teachers had revolutionized potions instruction, while his work with trauma specialists had helped him develop approaches that supported rather than intimidated struggling students. The changes in Snape himself were profound, reflecting the healing power of accountability and purpose. His natural intellect and protective instincts remained unchanged, but they were now directed toward building up students rather than tearing them down. His particular expertise in recognizing signs of abuse and neglect had made him an invaluable member of the student support team. Harry Potter entered the Great Hall with Hermione Granger at his side, their presence as student advocates representing the successful integration of youth voices into educational governance. At 12 years old, Harry carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone whose traumatic experiences had been transformed into tools for helping others, while his friendship with Hermione continued to demonstrate the benefits of cooperation between different backgrounds and perspectives. The student advocacy program that Harry and Hermione helped coordinate had become one of the most successful innovations at Hogwarts, giving young people opportunities to influence policies while learning valuable skills in leadership, communication, and collaborative problem-solving. Their work had already resulted in significant improvements to dormitory policies, meal programs, and disciplinary procedures. Professor Aurora Sinistra joined the meeting as the new head of Muggle Studies, her department having been completely redesigned to provide magical students with comprehensive understanding of the non-magical world, rather than the superficial and often condescending overview that had previously characterized the subject. Her collaboration with Muggle educators had produced curriculum that prepared magical students to interact respectfully and effectively with non-magical people and institutions. The expansion of Muggle studies reflected the broader recognition that magical society could no longer operate in isolation from the world around it. The new curriculum included everything from basic civics and government to technology and social issues, ensuring that magical students graduated with the knowledge necessary to participate constructively in integrated communities. Kingsley Shacklebolt arrived to provide the governmental perspective on the educational reforms, his role as Minister for Magic having given him unique insights into the political challenges of implementing systematic change while maintaining support from both progressive and traditional elements within magical society. His leadership had been crucial in securing the funding and legislative support necessary for the comprehensive transformation of magical education. The political transformation that had accompanied the educational reforms had been as significant as the practical changes, with elections throughout the magical world producing governments more committed to transparency and accountability than their predecessors. The exposure of systematic child welfare failures had created demands for broader governmental reform that extended far beyond the original scope of Harry's case. The morning session focused on the statistical outcomes that demonstrated the effectiveness of the integrated approach to magical education. The data was impressive, showing dramatic improvements in academic achievement, psychological well-being, and post-graduation success rates for students in the reformed system compared to historical averages. Dr. Miranda Clearwater, now Director of Student Psychological Services, presented research showing significant reductions in anxiety, depression, and behavioral problems among students receiving integrated support services. Her work had demonstrated that proper mental health care could prevent many of the problems that had previously been dismissed as inevitable aspects of adolescent development in magical environments. The psychological services transformation had been one of the most important aspects of the educational reforms, replacing the previous approach of ignoring mental health issues with comprehensive support that addressed the unique challenges faced by magical adolescents. The new programs included individual counseling, group therapy, family support, and crisis intervention services staffed by professionals trained in both magical and Muggle approaches to mental health. Arthur Weasley contributed the technological perspective, describing innovations that had improved communication between school and families while providing new tools for educational instruction. His enthusiasm for Muggle technology had been channeled into developing hybrid magical technological solutions that enhanced, rather than replaced, traditional magical education methods. The Technology Integration Program had particular significance for students from Muggle families who had previously struggled with the complete separation from familiar tools and communication methods during their time at school. The new systems allowed for regular contact with families while introducing magical students to technological approaches that complemented their magical abilities. The afternoon session included presentations from the first graduating classes of the reformed Hogwarts, young people whose educational experiences had been shaped by the new integrated approach to magical learning. Their achievements provided compelling evidence that the reforms were producing graduates better prepared for the complexities of modern life than traditional magical education had been able to achieve. Luna Lovegood, now in her final year, had become a symbol of how the reformed system supported students whose learning styles and interests didn't fit traditional expectations. Her natural creativity and unconventional thinking, which had previously been marginalized, were now recognized as valuable perspectives that enriched the educational community for all students. The individualized education programs that had emerged from the reforms ensured that students like Luna received support tailored to their specific strengths and challenges, rather than being forced to conform to narrow expectations about how magical learning should proceed. The approach had resulted in improved outcomes for students across the entire spectrum of abilities and interests. Neville Longbottom's transformation provided another compelling example of the benefits of trauma-informed educational approaches. His academic and personal growth under the new system demonstrated how proper support and understanding could help students overcome the effects of early trauma and develop their full potential. The student support services that had been developed specifically for children affected by trauma, loss, or family dysfunction had become a model for magical schools throughout the world. The comprehensive approach included counseling, academic accommodation, peer support programs, and family outreach services designed to address the root causes of educational difficulties rather than simply managing their symptoms. Dean Thomas and Seamus Finnegan represented the success of programs designed to support students from mixed magical Muggle backgrounds, their experiences highlighting how integrated education could help young people maintain connections to both communities while developing their magical abilities. Their friendship demonstrated the kind of cross-cultural understanding that the reformed system was designed to promote. The evening session concluded with reports from international delegations who had visited Hogwarts to observe the reformed system and adapt its innovations to their own educational contexts. The success of the integrated approach had attracted attention from magical schools around the world, with many institutions implementing similar reforms based on the British model. The international recognition that Hogwarts had received was particularly gratifying, given the institution's previous reputation for insular traditions and resistance to change. The transformation had demonstrated that even the most traditional institutions could evolve when confronted with compelling evidence of the need for reform and provided with practical alternatives to outdated approaches. Representatives from Beauxbatons Academy of Magic had implemented similar student advocacy programs, while Durmstrang Institute had adopted integrated medical services and trauma-informed disciplinary policies. The global impact of the reforms initiated by Harry's case continued to expand, influencing magical education on multiple continents. The North American magical schools had been particularly interested in the technology integration programs, adapting Arthur Weasley's innovations to their own cultural contexts while maintaining the essential principles of improved communication and enhanced educational tools. The success of these adaptations demonstrated that the core concepts underlying the reforms could be successfully implemented across different magical traditions. Asian magical institutions had focused primarily on the psychological support services, implementing comprehensive mental health programs that addressed the unique stresses faced by magical students in rapidly changing societies. The cross-cultural validation of trauma-informed educational approaches provided additional evidence for their effectiveness across different populations and contexts. As the day concluded, Harry reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred at the school, where he should have spent his formative years under very different circumstances. The Hogwarts he now visited as a student advocate bore little resemblance to the institution that had operated under Dumbledore's leadership, representing a fundamental shift from authoritarian traditions to collaborative governance that prioritized student welfare above all other considerations. McGonagall approached Harry and Hermione as they prepared to return to their current educational placement at the integrated Granger Academy, her expression carrying the warmth of someone who had witnessed the positive transformation that proper support could produce in young people who had faced significant challenges. "Harry," she said with genuine affection, "I want you to know that your courage in speaking about your experiences has made it possible for countless other students to receive the support and protection they deserve. Hogwarts is a better place because of the changes your case initiated." The recognition meant a great deal to Harry, coming from someone whose respect he valued and whose dedication to student welfare had been demonstrated through years of consistent advocacy. His relationship with McGonagall represented the kind of supportive adult connection that every child deserved, but that he had been denied during his early years. Hermione's contributions to the educational reforms had been equally significant, her analytical abilities having identified patterns and problems that adult educators had overlooked. Her research into optimal learning environments for magical students from diverse backgrounds had influenced policy development throughout the integrated educational system. The partnership between Harry and Hermione in advocacy work continued to demonstrate the benefits of cooperation between different strengths and perspectives, their friendship serving as a model for the kind of relationships the reformed educational system was designed to promote. Their collaboration had produced innovations that neither could have achieved independently. As they departed Hogwarts that evening, Harry carried with him the satisfaction of knowing that his painful experiences had ultimately produced changes that would benefit future generations of magical students. The school that had once operated according to traditions that enabled institutional failure had been transformed into a model of accountability, transparency, and genuine commitment to student welfare. The revolution in magical education that had emerged from Harry's case continued to expand its influence, establishing new standards for institutional responsibility that ensured no student would ever again be abandoned to neglect or abuse. The frightened boy who had once dreamed of attending Hogwarts had become the catalyst for changes that made the school worthy of every child's dreams and aspirations. The transformation was ongoing rather than complete, with continuous evaluation and improvement ensuring that the reforms remained responsive to student needs and emerging challenges. The commitment to accountability and transparency that had driven the initial changes provided the foundation for sustained progress that would benefit magical children for generations to come. The rebuilt Granger Integration Academy stood as a monument to the revolutionary changes that had transformed magical education throughout Britain and beyond. Named in honor of Dan and Emma Granger's tireless advocacy for Muggle-born students and their families, the school represented the successful fusion of magical and non-magical educational approaches that had emerged from the comprehensive reforms initiated by Harry Potter's case 3 years earlier. Harry Potter walked through the Academy's halls with the confident stride of someone who had found his place in the world after years of searching for belonging. At 13 years old, he had grown into his role as both student and mentor, helping younger children navigate the complexities of developing magical abilities while maintaining connections to both worlds. His transformation from terrified abuse victim to poised advocate continued to inspire everyone who witnessed his journey. The morning assembly brought together students from backgrounds that would have been unimaginable in traditional magical education. Muggle-born witches and wizards learned alongside children from ancient magical families, while students whose parents represented both communities served as natural bridges between different cultural perspectives. The diversity that had once been viewed as problematic was now recognized as one of the Academy's greatest strengths. Hermione Granger stood at the podium addressing her fellow students with the articulate passion that had made her one of the most effective youth advocates in the integrated educational system. Her presentation on the upcoming International Children's Protection Day commemoration reflected years of research and personal experience that had shaped policy development throughout both magical and Muggle communities. This year marks the 3rd anniversary of the Little Whinging incident that initiated the reforms we now take for granted, Hermione announced to the assembled students, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who understood the historical significance of the changes they were witnessing. We have an opportunity to demonstrate to the world that cooperation between different communities produces better outcomes than isolation and mistrust. The Little Whinging incident had become the commonly accepted term for the events that began with Harry's escape from Privet Drive, acknowledging the profound impact that one child's courage had produced on institutional structures throughout both worlds. The anniversary had evolved into an international observance dedicated to promoting child welfare and cross-cultural cooperation. Luna Lovegood raised her hand with characteristic directness, her unconventional perspective having been nurtured rather than suppressed by the Academy's individualized approach to education. Will we be including testimony from other children who have benefited from the reforms? Their voices might provide insights that adult perspectives cannot capture. The suggestion reflected the Academy's commitment to centering student voices in all aspects of educational policy and community engagement. Luna's natural ability to see patterns and connections that others missed had made her contributions particularly valuable to the ongoing evaluation and improvement of integrated educational approaches. Neville Longbottom spoke up from his position near the back of the assembly hall, his confidence a stark contrast to the timid boy he had been under traditional magical education. The trauma-informed support he had received at the Academy had helped him overcome the effects of his early experiences, while developing his considerable talents in both magical and Muggle subjects. Professor Sprout mentioned that families from other countries want to share their experiences with similar programs Neville offered, his voice steady and assured. Maybe we could coordinate with schools in France and Germany to create a really comprehensive international presentation. The international dimension of the reforms had become increasingly important as magical communities around the world adapted the British model to their own cultural contexts. The success of integrated educational approaches had created a global movement that continued to expand and evolve based on shared experiences and collaborative research. Dean Thomas and Seamus Finnegan, whose friendship represented the kind of cross-cultural understanding the Academy was designed to promote, suggested including artistic presentations that would make the commemoration accessible to younger children and families who might not be reached through traditional academic approaches. Their collaboration on multimedia projects had consistently produced work that communicated complex ideas through engaging and accessible formats. The planning session continued with contributions from students representing the full spectrum of backgrounds and abilities that characterized the Academy's diverse community. Each voice added perspective that enriched the overall understanding of how the reforms had affected different populations and what challenges remained to be addressed. Dr. Elizabeth Chen entered the assembly hall with the folder of medical research that had become her trademark contribution to discussions about integrated child welfare. Her role as the Academy's Director of Health Services had expanded to include coordination with medical professionals throughout the international network of schools implementing similar reforms. Students, Dr. Chen announced, I have some remarkable statistics to share about the health outcomes we've achieved through integrated medical care. The data provides compelling evidence for the effectiveness of the approaches we've developed here at the Academy. She activated the presentation system that seamlessly combined magical and Muggle technology, displaying charts and graphs that documented dramatic improvements in both physical and psychological health among students receiving integrated care. The evidence was particularly striking for children who had experienced trauma, or who came from families struggling to understand and support magical development. Compared to historical data from traditional magical schools, our students show 50% lower rates of anxiety and depression, 30% better academic performance, and virtually eliminated rates of serious disciplinary problems, Dr. Chen continued, her professional satisfaction evident in her presentation of the research findings. The medical transformation had been one of the most successful aspects of the educational reforms, with integrated approaches to healthcare having produced breakthrough improvements in outcomes for magical children, dealing with everything from minor injuries to serious psychological disorders. The collaboration between magical healers and Muggle medical professionals had created treatment protocols that addressed the complete range of factors affecting student well-being. Harry listened to the statistics with the particular interest of someone whose own recovery had been facilitated by the integrated medical approaches being discussed. His transformation from the malnourished, traumatized child found behind cardboard boxes to the healthy, confident young man he had become provided living proof of the effectiveness of trauma-informed care. Arthur Weasley arrived to provide updates on the technological innovations that had enhanced communication between the Academy and the families it served, his enthusiasm for Muggle magical integration having found perfect expression in the development of hybrid systems that improved educational outcomes while respecting the traditions of both communities. The communication improvements had been particularly significant for families struggling to understand and support their children's magical development. The new systems allowed for regular consultation with both magical and Muggle experts, ensuring that parents received the guidance and resources necessary to provide appropriate support at home. We've now connected with over 200 families across Britain through the integrated communication network, Arthur reported, his excitement barely contained as he described the expanding reach of the support systems. The feedback has been overwhelmingly positive, with parents reporting significant improvements in their ability to support their children's development. The family support programs had addressed one of the most persistent challenges in magical education, the isolation and confusion experienced by parents who lacked understanding of the magical world their children were entering. The comprehensive approach included education, counseling, support groups, and ongoing consultation services designed to strengthen family relationships rather than undermining them through forced separation. P.C. Sarah Whitman, now Chief Inspector of the Magical Muggle Relations Division, entered the Assembly Hall carrying reports from law enforcement agencies around the world that had implemented similar cooperative programs. Her role had evolved from local police constable to international consultant on child protection issues that affected both magical and non-magical communities. The expansion of joint child protection services had been one of the most significant developments emerging from Harry's case, with law enforcement agencies recognizing that effective protection required cooperation between different systems and perspectives. The integrated model had produced dramatic improvements in outcomes for vulnerable children while establishing new standards for accountability and transparency. "Students," Chief Inspector Whitman announced, "I want you to understand that the reforms you're experiencing here at the Academy have influenced child protection policies in 17 countries. Your voices and experiences continue to shape the development of better systems for protecting children throughout both worlds." The international recognition had been particularly meaningful for students who understood that their daily experiences of integrated education were contributing to broader social change. The knowledge that their participation in the reformed system was helping to protect other children provided additional motivation for engagement and advocacy. Minister for Magic Kingsley Shacklebolt arrived to provide the governmental perspective on the broader implications of the educational reforms, his leadership having been crucial in securing continued support for the integrated programs despite occasional resistance from traditionalist elements within magical society. The political transformation that had accompanied the educational reforms had been as significant as the practical changes, with elections throughout the magical world producing governments more committed to cooperation and transparency than their predecessors. The success of integrated approaches had created momentum for broader reforms that extended well beyond education and child welfare. The Academy represents the future of magical education. Kingsley addressed the students, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed the transformation from within governmental structures. Your success here demonstrates that cooperation between different communities produces better outcomes than isolation and mistrust. The morning session concluded with presentations from visiting delegations representing magical schools and child welfare organizations from around the world. Each group shared experiences from implementing similar reforms in their own contexts, contributing to the ongoing development and refinement of integrated approaches to magical education. The afternoon session focused on student-led workshops that allowed young people to share their experiences and insights with visiting professionals and policymakers. The workshops had become a signature feature of the Academy's approach to education, ensuring that student voices remained central to all aspects of institutional development and evaluation. Harry facilitated a workshop on trauma recovery and peer support, drawing on his personal experiences and training to help other students who had faced similar challenges. His ability to connect with frightened or angry children, combined with his understanding of institutional systems, had made him remarkably effective at helping young people navigate complex support services. The peer support programs had been among the most successful innovations at the Academy, with students who had overcome significant challenges serving as mentors and advocates for others facing similar situations. The approach recognized that young people often had unique insights into the needs and perspectives of their peers that adult professionals might miss. Hermione led a workshop on policy analysis and advocacy strategies, her exceptional research abilities having identified effective approaches for youth engagement in institutional reform. Her work had influenced policy development throughout the integrated educational system, demonstrating that young people could contribute substantively to complex decision-making processes when provided with appropriate support and training. The youth advocacy programs had transformed the relationship between students and educational institutions, replacing the traditional model of adult authority with collaborative governance that recognized young people as partners in their own education. The approach had produced better outcomes while teaching valuable skills in citizenship, leadership, and collaborative problem-solving. Luna conducted a workshop on creative approaches to problem-solving and conflict resolution, her unconventional perspective having been channeled into innovative methods for addressing interpersonal and institutional challenges. Her natural ability to see situations from multiple angles had made her particularly effective at helping groups find solutions that satisfied different interests and perspectives. The conflict resolution programs had addressed one of the persistent challenges in traditional magical education, where competitive house systems and rigid hierarchies had often created ongoing tensions between students from different backgrounds. The integrated approach emphasized cooperation and mutual support while still recognizing individual achievements and contributions. Neville facilitated a session on academic support and learning differences, his personal experience of overcoming educational challenges having provided insights into effective approaches for helping students who struggled with traditional teaching methods. His transformation demonstrated that proper support could help any student achieve their potential, regardless of initial difficulties or setbacks. The individualized education programs had been designed to address the full spectrum of learning styles and abilities represented in the student population, ensuring that educational approaches were adapted to student needs, rather than forcing students to conform to narrow expectations about how learning should proceed. The evening session included presentations from families who had benefited from the integrated support services, with parents and children sharing their experiences of navigating the complexities of magical Muggle family life with proper guidance and resources. The testimonials provided compelling evidence for the effectiveness of comprehensive family support programs. Dan and Emma Granger spoke about their journey from confusion and isolation to active participation in their daughter's magical education, their transformation reflecting the broader changes that had occurred in relationships between magical institutions and Muggle families. Their advocacy work had influenced policy development throughout the educational system, while demonstrating the value of including all stakeholders in reform processes. Other families shared similar stories of growth and understanding, with parents describing how integrated support services had helped them develop the knowledge and confidence necessary to support their children's development across both magical and Muggle domains. The consistent theme was that cooperation and communication produced better outcomes than separation and secrecy. The student presentations concluded with a comprehensive overview of the statistical outcomes that demonstrated the effectiveness of integrated educational approaches. The data showed improvements in academic achievement, psychological well-being, family relationships, and post-graduation success rates that provided compelling evidence for the continued expansion of the reformed model. As the day concluded, Harry reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred since his desperate flight from Privet Drive had initiated the reforms now taken for granted by students throughout the integrated educational system. The academy that had become his intellectual and emotional home represented everything he had dreamed of during his years in the cupboard under the stairs, a place where every child was valued and supported, regardless of their background or circumstances. The international recognition that the academy had received was particularly meaningful because it demonstrated that the principles underlying the reforms could be successfully adapted to different cultural contexts while maintaining their essential commitment to child welfare and cross-cultural cooperation. The global impact of changes initiated by one frightened boy's trust in P.C. Whitman continued to expand and evolve. Hermione joined Harry for the walk back to their residential facility, their conversation focusing on plans for expanding the youth advocacy programs to reach even more children in need of support and guidance. Their friendship continued to demonstrate the benefits of cooperation between different strengths and perspectives while providing mutual support for the challenging work of institutional reform. The residential facility that served as home for students like Harry and Hermione represented another successful innovation, providing stable family-like environments for children whose circumstances required placement outside traditional family structures. The approach emphasized healing and growth rather than mere custodial care, ensuring that residential placement enhanced rather than hindered student development. Sirius joined them for the evening meal, his role as Harry's guardian having evolved into something approaching equality as Harry matured and developed his own expertise in child welfare advocacy. Their relationship demonstrated the kind of supportive adult connection that every child deserved while respecting Harry's growing independence and authority in his chosen field of work. The evening routine they shared with other students in the residential facility reflected the Academy's commitment to creating environments that supported both individual growth and community connection. The balance between personal development and collaborative engagement had been carefully designed to address the needs of young people who had experienced disruption in their early family relationships. As Harry prepared for sleep in his comfortable room, surrounded by books and projects that reflected his interests and aspirations, he felt profound gratitude for the transformation that had occurred in his life and circumstances. The frightened boy who had once believed himself to be fundamentally broken and deserving of mistreatment had become a confident advocate whose work was protecting and empowering children throughout both magical and Muggle communities. The revolution in child welfare and education that had emerged from his case continued to expand its influence, establishing new standards for institutional responsibility that ensured no child would ever again be abandoned to abuse or neglect because they existed at the intersection of different worlds. The legacy of his courage in trusting P.C. Whitman with his story would protect magical children for generations to come. The renovated Children's Services office in Little Whinging bore little resemblance to the sterile governmental facility it had once been. The walls now displayed artwork created by children from both magical and Muggle communities, while the waiting area featured comfortable seating and play areas designed to make young visitors feel welcome rather than intimidated. The transformation reflected the broader changes that had occurred in child welfare services throughout Britain and beyond, with institutional environments redesigned to prioritize comfort and accessibility over bureaucratic efficiency. Harry Potter stood before the memorial plaque that had been installed near the main entrance, reading the simple inscription that commemorated the events that had begun in this very building nearly 4 years earlier. The brass plate bore a quote from Chief Inspector Sarah Whitman that had become the unofficial motto of the Integrated Child Protection Movement. Every child deserves to be believed, protected, and empowered to reach their full potential, regardless of the circumstances of their birth or the nature of their abilities. At 14 years old, Harry had grown into his role as the most recognizable advocate for institutional reform in child welfare, his personal transformation serving as living proof that proper support and care could help even the most traumatized children recover and thrive. His presence at the anniversary commemoration attracted media attention from around the world, but his focus remained on the practical work of ensuring that the reforms continued to expand and improve. Chief Inspector Sarah Whitman approached Harry with the warm, professional manner that had characterized their relationship since that night when she had found him hiding in an alley. Her promotion to Director of International Child Protection Coordination had been richly deserved, reflecting her pioneering work in establishing cooperative frameworks between magical and Muggle authorities that were now being implemented on multiple continents. "Harry," she said with genuine affection, "I wanted you to see the latest statistics on the children we've been able to help through the Integrated Protection Services. The numbers represent individual success stories that validate everything we've worked to achieve." She handed him a comprehensive report that documented the dramatic improvements in outcomes for vulnerable children that had been achieved through the reformed systems. The data was impressive, showing significant reductions in abuse cases, improvements in educational and psychological outcomes, and enhanced family stability across both magical and Muggle communities. The statistical transformation was remarkable, but Harry had learned to focus on the personal stories behind the numbers, understanding that each data point represented a child whose life had been improved through the institutional changes his case had initiated. The report included testimonials from families whose children had received support through the integrated services, their experiences demonstrating the effectiveness of cooperation between different systems and perspectives. Dr. Elizabeth Chen arrived carrying the medical research that had become her signature contribution to discussions about child welfare reform. Her work had revolutionized approaches to trauma-informed care, while establishing new standards for the treatment of magical children in both specialized and mainstream medical facilities. The integration of magical and Muggle medical approaches had produced breakthrough improvements in outcomes for children dealing with complex health challenges. "Harry, Doctor," Chen announced, "we have some remarkable developments to share about the expansion of integrated medical services to Scotland and Ireland. The success of our pilot programs has created demand for comprehensive implementation throughout the British Isles. The medical transformation had been one of the most successful aspects of the broader reforms, with integrated approaches to healthcare having produced dramatic improvements in outcomes for magical children, dealing with everything from routine medical needs to serious psychological disorders. The collaboration between magical healers and Muggle medical professionals had created treatment protocols that addressed the complete range of factors affecting child development and well-being. Arthur Weasley entered the facility with his characteristic enthusiasm, his role as Director of International Magical Muggle Technology Integration having given him unprecedented opportunities to develop communication and support systems that enhanced child protection services throughout both communities. His innovations had improved coordination between agencies while providing families with better access to resources and guidance. The technological improvements had been particularly significant for families in rural or isolated areas where access to specialized services had previously been limited or non-existent. The new systems allowed for remote consultation with experts, online support groups for parents and children, and comprehensive resource libraries that provided guidance on everything from magical development to trauma recovery. We've now connected over 1,500 families across Europe through the integrated support network, Arthur reported, his excitement evident as he described the expanding reach of the cooperative programs. The feedback continues to be overwhelmingly positive, with both magical and Muggle families reporting significant improvements in their ability to support their children's development. Hermione Granger arrived from her current placement at the International Commission on Magical Muggle Child Welfare, her work having expanded from local advocacy to global policy development that influenced reform efforts in dozens of countries. At 14, she had become one of the most respected voices in international discussions about cross-cultural cooperation in child protection, her analytical abilities having identified effective strategies for implementing integrated approaches across different cultural and governmental contexts. Her friendship with Harry had remained strong despite their different career paths, with their collaboration continuing to demonstrate the benefits of combining different strengths and perspectives in advocacy work. Their partnership had become a model for the kind of cooperative relationships that the reformed systems were designed to promote throughout both communities. "Harry," Hermione announced, with the focused intensity that characterized her approach to complex problems, "I have updates on the treaty negotiations for the International Framework on Magical Child Protection. The preliminary agreements establish unprecedented standards for cooperation between magical and Muggle authorities in protecting vulnerable children. The international treaty represented the culmination of years of diplomatic work that had emerged from the British reforms, with governments around the world recognizing that effective child protection required cooperation between different systems and authorities. The framework established binding commitments to information sharing, joint investigations, and coordinated support services that would benefit magical children regardless of their country of residence. Minister for Magic Kingsley Shacklebolt arrived to provide updates on the governmental transformation that had accompanied the practical reforms, his leadership having been crucial in maintaining political support for the integrated programs while addressing resistance from traditionalist elements within magical society. The success of the cooperative approaches had created momentum for broader reforms that extended well beyond child welfare to encompass multiple areas of magical-Muggle relations. The political changes had been as significant as the practical improvements, with elections throughout the magical world producing governments more committed to transparency and accountability than their predecessors. The exposure of systematic child welfare failures had created demands for broader institutional reform that continued to influence policy development years after the original crisis. Harry, Kingsley addressed him directly. "I want you to know that your testimony before the International Confederation of Wizards last month has influenced policy development in magical communities throughout Europe and North America. Your voice continues to shape the conversation about institutional responsibility and child protection." The recognition was meaningful to Harry, but his focus remained on the practical work of ensuring that the reforms continued to reach children who needed support and protection. His role had evolved from victim to survivor to advocate, but his fundamental commitment to preventing other children from experiencing the abuse and neglect he had endured remained constant. The afternoon session included a comprehensive review of the outcomes that had been achieved through 4 years of integrated child protection efforts. The statistical evidence was compelling, showing dramatic improvements in virtually every measure of child welfare across both magical and Muggle communities where the cooperative programs had been implemented. The data showed a 60% reduction in confirmed child abuse cases, reflecting both improved prevention efforts and enhanced support for families struggling with the challenges of raising magical children. The early intervention programs had been particularly effective, providing assistance before crisis situations developed rather than responding only after significant harm had occurred. Educational outcomes had improved even more dramatically, with magical children in integrated programs showing significantly higher academic achievement, better psychological adjustment, and enhanced preparation for adult life compared to historical averages from traditional magical education systems. The individualized approaches that had been developed for different learning styles and backgrounds had produced better outcomes across the full spectrum of student abilities and interests. Family stability measures showed equally impressive improvements, with divorce rates, domestic violence incidents, and child placement disruptions all declining significantly in communities where integrated support services were available. The comprehensive approach to family support had addressed the root causes of dysfunction rather than simply managing its symptoms. The international recognition that the British model had received was particularly gratifying, with delegations from magical communities around the world visiting to observe the reformed systems and adapt their principles to different cultural contexts. The success of the integrated approach had inspired similar reforms in countries throughout Europe, North America, and other regions where magical and Muggle populations intersected. Sirius Black arrived to participate in the commemoration, his transformation from wrongfully imprisoned fugitive to respected advocate for criminal justice reform, having paralleled Harry's journey from victim to survivor to institutional change agent. Their relationship had evolved into something approaching equality, with Sirius recognizing Harry's expertise and authority in child welfare advocacy, while continuing to provide the stability and support every young person deserved. The legal reforms that had emerged from Sirius's case had been as significant as the child welfare changes, establishing new standards for evidence evaluation, wrongful conviction prevention, and post-incarceration support that had influenced criminal justice systems throughout both magical and Muggle communities. The integration of different legal traditions and investigative approaches had produced more accurate and fair outcomes while maintaining appropriate protections for both victims and accused persons. P.C. Sarah Whitman, now bearing the title of director that reflected her international responsibilities, presented the annual report on child protection outcomes that had become the definitive measure of progress in integrated services. The document represented the collaborative work of hundreds of professionals from both communities who had contributed to the ongoing development and refinement of cooperative approaches to child welfare. The report documented not just statistical improvements, but the qualitative changes that had occurred in relationships between institutions and the families they served. Trust levels between authorities and communities had increased significantly, reflecting the transparent and accountable approaches that characterized the reformed systems. Families were more willing to seek help when problems arose, leading to earlier intervention and better outcomes for children at risk. The most significant section of the report focused on the prevention programs that had been developed to address the root causes of child abuse and neglect before they resulted in harm to children. The comprehensive approach included parent education, family support services, community outreach programs, and early intervention initiatives that had dramatically reduced the incidence of serious abuse cases. Dr. Miranda Clearwater contributed the psychological research that documented the long-term outcomes for children who had received services through the integrated programs. Her longitudinal studies showed that early intervention and comprehensive support produced lasting benefits that extended well into adulthood, with participants showing higher rates of educational achievement, career success, and healthy family relationships compared to control groups. The psychological transformation had been particularly significant for children who had experienced trauma, with integrated therapeutic approaches having produced recovery rates that exceeded anything previously achieved through traditional treatment methods. The combination of magical healing techniques with evidence-based Muggle therapies had created new possibilities for addressing even severe psychological injuries. As the formal commemoration concluded, Harry reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him from the cupboard under the stairs to a position of influence in shaping policies that protected children throughout both magical and Muggle communities. The transformation had been profound, but his commitment to ensuring that no child experienced the abuse and neglect he had endured remained the driving force behind his continued advocacy work. The evening session included informal conversations with families who had benefited from the integrated services, their stories providing compelling evidence for the human impact of the institutional reforms. Parents described how access to proper support and guidance had transformed their ability to understand and nurture their children's development, while young people shared their experiences of growing up in systems designed to support rather than suppress their potential. One particularly moving testimonial came from a family whose daughter had been struggling with uncontrolled magical outbursts that had been misdiagnosed as a psychological disorder by professionals who lacked understanding of magical development. The integrated medical services had provided proper diagnosis and treatment that had transformed both the child's well-being and the family's ability to provide appropriate support. Another family described their experience of navigating the complexities of having children with different levels of magical ability, with the integrated educational programs having provided individualized support that honored each child's unique needs and strengths. The parents credited the comprehensive family support services with helping them maintain strong relationships with all their children, despite the challenges posed by magical Muggle differences. The consistent theme throughout these testimonials was that cooperation and communication between different systems and perspectives produced better outcomes than isolation and secrecy. The families emphasized that they felt supported and empowered rather than judged or excluded by the authorities responsible for their children's welfare and education. As the day concluded, Harry walked through the halls of the renovated Children's Services Office with Chief Inspector Whitman, their conversation focusing on plans for expanding the integrated programs to reach even more children in need of support and protection. The facility that had once been a sterile, bureaucratic environment had been transformed into a welcoming space where children and families could access comprehensive services designed to address their complete range of needs. The transformation extended beyond physical renovation to encompass fundamental changes in the relationship between authorities and the communities they served. The adversarial dynamics that had characterized traditional child protection services had been replaced by collaborative approaches that recognized families as partners in ensuring children's welfare rather than obstacles to be overcome. Harry paused before the memorial plaque one final time, reading the inscription that had become so familiar but remained meaningful to him as a reminder of the principles that had guided the reforms from their beginning. The simple commitment to believing, protecting, and empowering every child had produced changes that extended far beyond anything he had imagined when he first trusted P.C. Whitman with his story. Chief Inspector Whitman joined him in front of the memorial, her expression carrying the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed the practical impact of principled advocacy over years of dedicated work. "Harry," she said quietly, "I want you to understand that the child who ran through those streets 4 years ago has become the catalyst for changes that will protect magical children for generations to come." The recognition was meaningful, but Harry's focus remained on the ongoing work rather than past achievements. The reforms had established strong foundations, but maintaining and expanding their impact required continued vigilance and advocacy from people who understood the importance of putting children's welfare above institutional convenience or traditional prejudices. Sirius joined them for the walk back to their comfortable home, their evening routine providing the stability and normalcy that had been absent from Harry's early years, but that every child deserved as a foundation for healthy development. The relationship they had built demonstrated the healing power of appropriate adult support, combined with recognition of a young person's growing independence and expertise. Their conversation during the walk home focused on plans for the upcoming International Conference on Child Protection that would bring together advocates, professionals, and policymakers from around the world to share experiences and develop new approaches to cross-cultural cooperation in child welfare. Harry's keynote presentation would provide the conference with a unique perspective on institutional transformation from someone who had experienced both the failures of traditional systems and the successes of reformed approaches. As they prepared dinner together in their kitchen, Harry reflected on the profound changes that had occurred not just in his individual circumstances, but in the broader relationship between magical and Muggle society. The institutions that had failed so dramatically had been rebuilt on foundations of accountability, transparency, and genuine commitment to child welfare that ensured the mistakes of the past could never be repeated on such a systematic scale. The statistical evidence was compelling, but Harry found the most meaningful validation in the individual stories of children who had received support through the integrated services. Each success represented a life that had been improved through the reforms, a family that had been strengthened through proper support, and a community that had become more inclusive and protective of its most vulnerable members. The international recognition that the British model continued to receive demonstrated that the principles underlying the reforms could be successfully adapted to different cultural and governmental contexts while maintaining their essential commitment to child welfare and cross-cultural cooperation. The global impact of changes initiated by one frightened boy's trust in P.C. Whitman continued to expand and evolve, influencing policy development on multiple continents. As Harry settled into his comfortable bed that evening, surrounded by books and projects that reflected his interests and aspirations, he felt profound gratitude for the transformation that had occurred in both his personal circumstances and the broader systems responsible for protecting children. The frightened boy who had once believed himself to be fundamentally broken and deserving of mistreatment had become a confident advocate whose work was making a tangible difference in the lives of vulnerable children throughout both magical and Muggle communities. The revolution in child welfare and institutional accountability that had emerged from his case had achieved its fundamental objectives, establishing new standards for cooperation between different systems and authorities that prioritized individual welfare over institutional convenience. The legacy of his courage in trusting one police constable with his story would continue to protect magical children for generations to come, ensuring that no child would ever again be sacrificed for the supposed greater good or abandoned to abuse because they existed at the intersection of different worlds. The transformation was complete, not just in Harry's individual journey from victim to advocate, but in the fundamental relationship between magical and Muggle society and their shared responsibility for protecting and nurturing the children who represented the future of both communities. The institutions that had failed so catastrophically had been rebuilt on foundations that would ensure such systematic failures could never occur again, creating a legacy of protection and empowerment that would benefit countless children yet to be born. P.C. Sarah Whitman arrived at Privet Drive the following morning with a grim determination that had kept her awake most of the night. The medical report on Harry Potter made for disturbing reading, documenting years of systematic neglect and abuse that painted a picture of child welfare failures on multiple levels. As she walked up the pristine pathway to number 4, she noted the stark contrast between the house's immaculate exterior and the horrific conditions in which the boy had been living inside. The morning sun cast sharp shadows across the manicured lawn, highlighting every perfectly trimmed hedge and spotless window. It was the kind of neighborhood where appearances mattered more than reality, where dirty secrets could be hidden behind net curtains and false smiles. Sarah had worked enough domestic abuse cases to know that the most dangerous homes often looked the most normal from the outside. Vernon Dursley answered the door with a practiced expression of concerned confusion that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was exactly as Harry had described him, a massive man whose bulk filled the doorway and whose presence radiated barely contained aggression. His small eyes darted nervously as they took in Sarah's uniform and the official paperwork in her hands. "Mr. Dursley," Sarah said, her tone professionally neutral despite the disgust she felt. "I'm P.C. Whitman from Surrey Police. I understand you've been looking for Harry Potter." Vernon's face went through a series of interesting colour changes, from pale surprise to flushed indignation. "Of course we've been looking for him," he blustered. "The boy ran off yesterday evening without a word. We've been worried sick." The lie rolled off his tongue with practiced ease. But Sarah had heard enough false concern from abusive guardians to recognize the performance. She made a note in her pad, watching Vernon's reaction carefully. "I see. And when exactly did you notice Harry was missing?" Vernon's eyes shifted uncomfortably. "Well, it was around dinner time. Petunia called him to eat, and he didn't answer. We found his cupboard empty." "His cupboard?" Sarah repeated, her pen stopping mid-sentence. "Could you show me where Harry sleeps, please?" The question clearly caught Vernon off guard. His mouth opened and closed several times before he managed a response. "Well, yes, of course. It's just temporary, you understand. We've been meaning to fix up a proper room for him, but with Dudley needing space for his things—" Sarah followed Vernon into the house, noting the expensive furnishings and obvious signs of wealth that made his excuses even more damning. The living room was spacious and well-appointed, with a large television, comfortable furniture, and family photographs covering every available surface. None of the photographs included Harry. The cupboard under the stairs was exactly as Harry had described it, but seeing it in person made Sarah's professional composure crack slightly. The space was barely large enough for storage, let alone housing a growing child. A thin mattress lay on the floor, along with a few items of clothing that looked more like rags than proper garments. The door had multiple locks on the outside. "Mr. Dursley," Sarah said, her voice dangerously quiet, "how long has Harry been sleeping in this cupboard?" Vernon's face had gone purple again, a sure sign of his rising panic. "It's not what it looks like," he stammered. "The boy prefers small spaces. He feels safer in there." We tried to give him Dudley's second bedroom, but he kept sneaking back to the cupboard. Sarah made extensive notes, photographing the space from multiple angles. The smell of neglect was overwhelming, and she noticed what appeared to be scratch marks on the inside of the door, as if someone had been trying to get out rather than in. "Where is your wife, Mr. Dursley? I'd like to speak with her as well." Petunia Dursley emerged from the kitchen with an expression of wounded dignity that might have been convincing if not for the way her eyes kept darting toward the cupboard. She was as thin as her husband was broad, with a sharp face and nervous mannerisms that suggested a lifetime of anxiety and resentment. "Mrs. Dursley," Sarah began, "I need to ask you about Harry's living conditions and general care. Can you tell me about his daily routine?" Petunia's lips compressed into a thin line. "Harry is a difficult child," she said primly. "We've done our best with him, but he has behavioral problems, destructive tendencies. We've had to be firm." "What kind of behavioral problems?" The question seemed to unlock a flood of complaints that had been building for years. Petunia launched into a detailed recitation of Harry's supposed crimes, from breaking dishes to causing electrical problems to making their neighbors' gardens wither. As she spoke, Sarah began to notice a pattern in the incidents she described. Every event Petunia mentioned involved unexplained phenomena that defied normal explanation. Lights flickering without cause, objects moving on their own, electronic devices malfunctioning when Harry was upset or afraid. Any one of these incidents might have been dismissed as coincidence or imagination, but the sheer volume of them suggested something more unusual was occurring. "Mrs. Dursley," Sarah interrupted during a particularly elaborate story about exploding pudding. "These incidents you're describing, have you ever sought professional help for Harry? Consulted with doctors or specialists about these behaviors?" Petunia's face went pale. We thought it best to handle things privately. Family matters, you understand. But you were planning to send him to an institution." The Thornfield Institute, I believe Harry mentioned? The effect of those words on both Dursleys was immediate and dramatic. Vernon's face went from purple to grey, while Petunia actually took a step backward, as if she'd been physically struck. "How did you—" Vernon started, then stopped himself. That was just a consideration. We thought Harry might benefit from professional help with his problems. Sarah consulted her notes, though she had memorized every detail of her conversation with Harry the night before. "According to Harry, you told him a van was coming this morning to take him away permanently." "That doesn't sound like professional help, Mr. Dursley. That sounds like abandonment." "Now see here," Vernon sputtered, but Sarah cut him off with a raised hand. "I need to speak with your neighbours, get their perspective on Harry's situation and these unusual incidents you've described." The suggestion sent both Dursleys into a panic. "That's not necessary," Petunia said quickly. "Our neighbours are very private people. They won't want to get involved." Sarah smiled grimly. "In my experience, Mrs. Dursley, neighbours are often more observant than people realise, especially when it comes to children's welfare." She left the Dursleys with instructions not to leave town while the investigation was ongoing, a restriction that seemed to terrify them more than any criminal charge might have. As she walked across the street to begin her canvass of Privet Drive, Sarah reflected on how quickly a routine missing child case had become something much more complex and disturbing. Mrs. Henderson from number 3 was eager to talk, though she seemed nervous about being seen cooperating with police. She was a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and the slightly guilty expression of someone who had been harbouring concerns for years without acting on them. "That poor little boy," she said, glancing toward the Dursley house, as if afraid of being overheard. "I've been worried about him for ages, but I didn't know who to call or what to say. The things I've heard coming from that house—" "What kinds of things, Mrs. Henderson?" "Shouting, mostly. Vernon Dursley screaming at someone, usually late at night, and crying. A child crying for hours sometimes. I mentioned it to my husband once, said maybe we should call someone, but he said it wasn't our business." Sarah made careful notes, encouraging Mrs. Henderson to continue. The woman's story painted a picture of systematic abuse that the entire neighborhood had witnessed but failed to report. Late-night shouting matches, a child who was never allowed to play with others, strange incidents involving lights and electrical equipment that occurred whenever the Dursleys seemed particularly angry. "And there was something else," Mrs. Henderson added reluctantly. "Sometimes I'd see the boy in their back garden, thin as a rail, doing chores that seemed too heavy for someone his age, moving furniture, digging in the garden, scrubbing the driveway. In all weather, mind you. I saw him out there in the middle of winter once, no coat, trying to clear ice from their car windscreen with his bare hands." "Why didn't you call social services?" Sarah asked, though she kept her tone non-judgmental. These cases were complicated, and she knew that bystander paralysis was a real phenomenon. "Mrs. Henderson's face crumpled with guilt. "We thought about it. My husband and I, we discussed it more than once. But the Dursleys seemed so respectable, and we only saw bits and pieces. We convinced ourselves that maybe we were misunderstanding the situation. And honestly, Constable, Vernon Dursley is not a man you want to cross. He's got a temper, and he holds grudges." The next stop was Mrs. Arabella Figg at number 7, an encounter that proved to be far more complex than Sarah had anticipated. The elderly woman answered her door surrounded by an impressive collection of cats, her appearance exactly matching the stereotype of the eccentric cat lady. But her eyes were sharp and intelligent, and she seemed to be expecting Sarah's visit. "You're here about Harry Potter," Mrs. Figg said, before Sarah could introduce herself. "I saw what happened yesterday evening. Poor little boy, running through the streets like that." Sarah's instincts immediately went on alert. There was something in the woman's manner that suggested she knew more than she was letting on, a careful quality to her words that spoke of secrets being held. "You saw Harry yesterday evening?" Sarah asked. "Why didn't you try to help him?" Mrs. Figg's expression became pained, and she glanced around nervously as if checking for eavesdroppers. "I wanted to," she said quietly. "You have no idea how much I wanted to. But there are circumstances that prevented me from intervening directly." "What kind of circumstances?" The older woman seemed to wrestle with herself for a moment before responding. "I'm not supposed to get involved. There are people, important people, who have given specific instructions about Harry's care. I was told to watch and report, but never to interfere." Sarah's pen stopped moving across her notepad. "Mrs. Figg, are you saying that someone in authority knew about Harry's situation and chose not to act?" Mrs. Figg's face went pale, and she looked around again with obvious fear. "I shouldn't have said that. Please, you have to understand. There are things about Harry's situation that are more complicated than they appear. People who think they know what's best for him, even if their methods seem harsh." "Who are these people?" Sarah pressed. "I need names, Mrs. Figg. If there's an authority figure who was aware of child abuse and failed to act, that's a serious crime." But Mrs. Figg had already begun closing her door, her courage apparently failing her. "I'm sorry," she said. "I can't say any more." "But please, Constable, be careful. Harry is more important than you realize, and there are powerful people who won't appreciate your interference." The door closed with finality, leaving Sarah standing on the doorstep with more questions than answers. The conversation had been cryptic, but the implications were clear enough. Someone in a position of authority had been aware of Harry's abuse and had chosen to allow it to continue. The thought filled Sarah with a cold rage that she hadn't felt since her earliest days as a police officer. She continued her canvass of the neighborhood, speaking to everyone who was willing to talk. The picture that emerged was consistent and damning. Harry Potter had been systematically abused and neglected for years, while an entire community watched and did nothing. Worse, there seemed to be some kind of official sanction for his mistreatment, a conspiracy of silence that reached beyond the simple bystander effect. Mr. Wickham from number 5 had noticed the strange electrical problems that seemed to follow the Dursleys around. Streetlights would blow out when Vernon was particularly angry, car alarms would go off for no reason, and electronic devices would malfunction whenever there seemed to be trouble at number 4. The man had even called the electric company several times, but they could never find any problems with the local power grid. Mrs. Patterson from number 2 had observed Harry being forced to do dangerous household chores that were completely inappropriate for a child his age. She had seen him cleaning gutters, handling heavy gardening equipment, and working with household chemicals that should never have been accessible to an 8-year-old. Every conversation added another layer to the growing picture of systematic abuse and community failure. By the time Sarah returned to her car, she had enough witness statements to support serious criminal charges against the Dursleys. But she also had a growing sense that this case was more complex than a simple domestic abuse situation. The mysterious authority figures Mrs. Figg had mentioned, the unexplained phenomena that multiple witnesses had observed, and the general atmosphere of secrecy surrounding Harry's situation all suggested that there were elements to this case that went beyond standard police work. Sarah sat in her car outside number 4 Privet Drive and reviewed her notes, trying to make sense of the contradictions and mysteries she had uncovered. Harry Potter was clearly the victim of severe abuse and neglect, but he was also apparently the subject of some kind of official interest that had prevented intervention until now. The strange incidents that followed him wherever he went defied normal explanation, yet they were too well documented by too many witnesses to dismiss as imagination. She was interrupted by her radio crackling to life. "Control to PC Whitman," came the dispatcher's voice. "We have the hospital report you requested on the Potter boy. You need to see this as soon as possible." Sarah started her engine and headed back toward the hospital, her mind racing with possibilities. Whatever was in that medical report, she had a feeling it was going to complicate an already complex case even further. At the hospital, Dr. Elizabeth Chen was waiting with a thick folder and an expression of barely controlled professional outrage. Dr. Chen was known throughout the hospital for her calm demeanour and clinical objectivity, but the Potter case had clearly gotten under her skin in a way that few cases did. "Constable Whitman," Dr. Chen said without preamble, "I need to speak with you about Harry Potter's medical condition. What I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible, but I need you to listen with an open mind." Sarah settled into a chair across from the doctor, her notebook ready. After the morning she'd had, she was prepared to consider possibilities that would normally seem far-fetched. "Harry's physical condition is consistent with years of systematic abuse and neglect," Dr. Chen began. "Malnutrition, multiple healed fractures, evidence of repeated physical trauma. But there are other aspects of his case that I can't explain through conventional medical knowledge, such as—" Dr. Chen opened the folder and spread several documents across her desk. "His blood work shows readings that are completely outside normal parameters, but not in a way that suggests disease or illness. His neurological responses are extraordinary, showing brain activity patterns I've never seen before. And there are physical phenomena occurring around him that simply shouldn't be possible." "What kind of phenomena?" Dr. Chen looked uncomfortable, as if she was about to confess to belief in something that contradicted her scientific training. "Electronic equipment malfunctions when he's upset or afraid. Not just occasionally, Constable, but consistently and predictably. We've had to move him to a room without electronic monitoring equipment because the machines can't function properly in his presence." Sarah thought of the stories she'd heard from the neighbours about electrical problems following the Dursleys around. "Could you be more specific about these malfunctions? This morning, when one of the nurses tried to take his temperature with a digital thermometer, the device simply stopped working the moment it came near him. Not broken, mind you, just completely non-functional. When she moved away from him, it worked normally again. The same thing happened with the blood pressure cuff, the electronic scale, even the automatic doors to his room." Dr. Chen leaned forward, her expression intense. "Constable, in 20 years of medical practice, I've never encountered anything like this. But there's more. Harry has been talking about things that happened to him, memories that seem impossible but are described with perfect clinical accuracy." "What kind of memories?" "He's described medical procedures that were performed on him as an infant, procedures he couldn't possibly remember. He's mentioned being in a room with multiple adults who were discussing his future, conversations that took place when he was barely 2 years old. The level of detail he provides is extraordinary, and much of what he says can be verified through hospital records I've obtained from his early childhood." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "Dr. Chen, are you suggesting that Harry has some kind of enhanced memory abilities?" "I don't know what I'm suggesting," Dr. Chen admitted, "but I do know that this child is unlike any patient I've ever treated. The phenomena around him, his unusual physiological readings, his enhanced recall abilities, they all point to something beyond normal human variation." Sarah closed her notebook, realizing that her investigation had just taken a turn into territory she was completely unprepared for. The case of Harry Potter was clearly more complex than a simple abuse situation, involving unexplained phenomena that challenged conventional understanding of reality itself. "Has Harry mentioned anything about these abilities? Does he understand what's happening to him?" Dr. Chen's expression softened with sympathy. "That's perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of this entire situation. Harry thinks he's broken. He's been told his entire life that the things that happen around him are his fault, that he's damaged and dangerous. The psychological trauma from that kind of conditioning is severe." Sarah stood up, her mind already racing ahead to the implications of what she had learned. "Dr. Chen, I need you to document everything you've told me in an official report, and I need you to be prepared to testify about your findings if this case goes to court." "Of course," Dr. Chen agreed. "But Constable, you need to understand that what I've documented here challenges everything we think we know about human capabilities. If this information becomes public, It's going to raise questions that I'm not sure we're prepared to answer." As Sarah left the hospital, she realized that her investigation had uncovered something far more significant than child abuse, though the abuse itself remained the most important immediate concern. Harry Potter was apparently a child with extraordinary abilities who had been systematically mistreated by people who either didn't understand or actively feared what he represented. More troubling was the suggestion that authority figures had known about his situation and had chosen to allow his abuse to continue. The implications of that revelation reached far beyond a single family in Little Whinging, suggesting a conspiracy of silence that could involve government agencies or other powerful institutions. Sarah sat in her car outside the hospital and tried to decide on her next step. Standard police procedure would be to file charges against the Dursleys and refer Harry to social services for placement in a safer environment. But the unusual aspects of this case suggested that normal procedures might not be adequate to protect the boy or uncover the full extent of the institutional failures that had allowed his abuse to continue. She made a decision that would change the course of her career and ultimately reshape the hidden world that had failed Harry Potter so completely. Instead of following standard procedure, she was going to dig deeper, follow every lead, and uncover the truth about who had known about Harry's situation and why they had allowed it to continue. Detective Inspector Marcus Webb was going to be very interested in what she had discovered, and together they were going to make sure that everyone responsible for Harry's suffering faced the full consequences of their actions, no matter how powerful or well-connected they might be. The investigation that would ultimately expose the wizarding world had begun in earnest, driven by one police constable's refusal to accept easy answers or official silence when a child's welfare was at stake. Detective Inspector Marcus Webb had seen enough disturbing cases in his 20-year career to think he was prepared for anything, but the file P.C. Whitman placed on his desk that afternoon challenged every assumption he had made about the limits of human cruelty and the boundaries of rational explanation. The Potter case, as it was already being called in the station, represented a convergence of systematic child abuse and unexplained phenomena that demanded investigation at the highest levels. Webb was a methodical man, built like a rugby player who had traded physical confrontation for intellectual pursuit. His graying hair and lined face spoke of decades spent dealing with humanity's darker impulses, but his sharp eyes remained alert and engaged. He prided himself on his ability to see patterns that others missed, connections that revealed the larger picture behind seemingly isolated incidents. The medical reports alone would have been enough to justify serious criminal charges against the Dursleys, Webb reflected, as he reviewed Dr. Chen's findings. Years of systematic abuse, documented malnutrition, evidence of repeated physical trauma that painted a picture of a childhood marked by cruelty and neglect. But it was the unexplained phenomena that had brought the case to his attention, elements that suggested this was far more than a routine domestic abuse situation. Webb looked up as P.C. Whitman entered his office, her expression carrying the focused intensity of an officer who had stumbled onto something significant. Sarah Whitman was one of his most capable constables, known for her thoroughness and her refusal to accept easy answers when dealing with complex cases. If she said the Potter case required his personal attention, he was inclined to believe her. "Sir," Whitman began without preamble, "I need to brief you on some developments in the Potter investigation that go well beyond what we initially suspected." Webb gestured for her to sit down, noting the thick folder she carried and the slight tension in her manner that suggested she was about to present information that challenged conventional understanding. He had learned to recognize that particular expression over the years, usually preceding cases that would test the boundaries of his investigative experience. "Before we begin," Webb said, "I want you to know that I've been in contact with the Home Office about this case. The unusual elements you mentioned in your preliminary report have attracted attention at levels well above our usual jurisdiction." Whitman's eyebrows rose slightly. "What kind of attention, sir?" "The kind that suggests there are aspects of Harry Potter's situation that involve matters of national security or governmental oversight. I received a call this morning from someone claiming to represent a specialized department within the Home Office, asking detailed questions about our investigation and the phenomena you documented. Webb opened his own folder, revealing documents that bore official seals and classification markings that Whitman had never seen before. The correspondence was brief but official, requesting comprehensive reports on all aspects of the Potter case and instructing local authorities to maintain strict confidentiality while the matter was under review. "What did you tell them?" Whitman asked, her instincts as an investigator immediately alert to the implications of high-level governmental interest in what should have been a straightforward child abuse case. "I told them that we would continue our investigation according to standard procedures, and that the welfare of the child remained our primary concern," Webb replied. "But I also made it clear that we would need official explanations for any unusual aspects of this case if they expected our full cooperation." Whitman nodded approvingly, recognizing her superior's refusal to be intimidated by bureaucratic pressure. She opened her own folder and began spreading documents across Webb's desk, each page adding another layer to an increasingly complex puzzle. "Sir, what I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible, but I need you to hear me out. The phenomena surrounding Harry Potter aren't random or explainable through conventional means. They follow consistent patterns that suggest something far beyond normal human capabilities." Webb leaned back in his chair, his expression non-committal but attentive. He had learned long ago that the best investigators sometimes encountered cases that challenged conventional wisdom, and his respect for Whitman's judgment earned her a fair hearing, even for the most extraordinary claims. "This morning, while Harry was having breakfast at the hospital, I witnessed something that I'm still trying to process," Whitman continued. He became upset while talking to Dr. Chen about his memories of living with the Dursleys, and every piece of electronic equipment in the pediatric ward stopped functioning simultaneously. "Not malfunctioned," Webb clarified. "Stopped functioning? Completely ceased operation," Whitman confirmed. "Monitors, computers, automatic doors, even the digital clocks on the walls. The moment Harry calmed down, everything began working normally again." "Doctor, Chen has documented similar incidents occurring throughout his stay at the hospital." Webb made careful notes, his expression thoughtful rather than skeptical. The consistency of the reports from multiple credible witnesses gave weight to claims that might otherwise be dismissed as imagination or hysteria. "There's more, sir. The financial investigation into the Dursleys has revealed some extremely disturbing irregularities. They've been receiving substantial monthly payments for 8 years from a source that doesn't appear to exist in any official records." Webb looked up sharply. "How substantial? Enough to support a comfortable middle-class lifestyle without any other visible means of income," Whitman replied. "Vernon Dursley works for a drill company, but his salary alone wouldn't support their standard of living. The payments have been coming through a series of shell companies and offshore accounts that seem designed to obscure their true origin." The detective inspector felt the familiar tingle of recognition that came when seemingly unrelated elements of a case began forming a coherent pattern. Unexplained phenomena, mysterious payments, governmental interest, and systematic child abuse were combining into something that suggested conspiracy at a level he had rarely encountered. "Have you been able to trace the source of these payments?" Whitman's expression grew grim. "That's where things become even more interesting, sir. Every lead we follow ends at an office that doesn't officially exist, staffed by people who have no records of employment or even existence in government databases. It's as if someone has created an entire bureaucratic structure specifically to manage Harry Potter's placement with the Dursleys." Webb stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the busy street below, while he processed the implications of what Whitman had told him. The existence of a shadow bureaucracy dedicated to managing a single child's welfare suggested governmental involvement at levels that went far beyond normal child services operations. "P.C. Whitman," he said finally, "I want you to understand that we're entering territory that could have serious implications for both our careers and possibly our personal safety. If there's truly a conspiracy involving governmental agencies and Harry Potter's welfare, the people responsible have resources and authority that far exceed our own. Whitman met his gaze steadily. With respect, sir, Harry Potter is an 8-year-old boy who has been systematically abused for years, while people in positions of authority stood by and allowed it to happen. Whatever the implications might be, we can't abandon our responsibility to protect him. Webb nodded approvingly, recognizing the moral clarity that made Whitman an exceptional officer. Her refusal to be intimidated by the scope of the conspiracy they were uncovering reminded him why he had chosen police work in the first place. Agreed. But we're going to proceed very carefully and document everything exhaustively. If we're challenging people with this level of resources and authority, we need to be absolutely certain of our evidence and prepared for whatever response our investigation might provoke. Over the next hour, Whitman briefed Webb on every aspect of her investigation, from the neighbor's testimony about years of witnessed abuse to Mrs. Figg's cryptic warnings about powerful people who wouldn't appreciate interference. The detective inspector listened with growing concern, recognizing the hallmarks of a cover-up that reached into the highest levels of government. The picture that emerged was of a child with extraordinary abilities who had been deliberately placed in an abusive situation by people who understood exactly what they were condemning him to endure. The systematic nature of the abuse, combined with the mysterious payments and governmental oversight, suggested that Harry's suffering had been considered an acceptable price for some larger objective. Sir, Whitman concluded, I believe Harry Potter is the victim of a conspiracy that involves not just child abuse, but a deliberate program of psychological conditioning designed to keep him isolated and dependent. The question is why anyone would consider that necessary. Webb had reached the same conclusion, though he found the implications almost too disturbing to accept. The idea that governmental agencies might deliberately subject a child to abuse for strategic purposes challenged his fundamental beliefs about the institutions he had spent his career serving. We need more evidence, he said finally, and we need to be prepared for the possibility that our investigation will be shut down or redirected if we get too close to sensitive information. That afternoon, Webb accompanied Whitman to the hospital for a personal interview with Harry Potter, determined to assess the boy's condition and capabilities firsthand. The detective inspector had interviewed hundreds of child abuse victims over his career, but Harry's case promised to be unlike anything he had previously encountered. Harry was sitting by the window in his hospital room when they arrived, looking small and fragile in the oversized hospital gown, but with an alertness in his green eyes that suggested intelligence and resilience beyond his years. Dr. Chen had warned them that the boy was remarkably articulate for his age, with a vocabulary and level of understanding that reflected both natural intelligence and premature exposure to adult concerns. "Hello, Harry," Webb said gently, settling into a chair beside the boy's bed. "I'm Detective Inspector Webb. P.C. Whitman has told me a lot about you, and I wanted to meet you personally." Harry studied Webb's face with the careful assessment of a child who had learned to evaluate adult intentions quickly and accurately. The detective inspector recognized the look, having seen it in other abuse victims who had developed hypervigilance as a survival mechanism. "Are you here to ask me more questions about the Dursleys?" Harry asked, his voice carrying a weariness that was heartbreaking in someone so young. "Partly," Webb admitted. "But I'm also here because I want to understand what's been happening to you, all of it. P.C. Whitman tells me there have been some unusual incidents that the doctors can't explain." Harry's expression became guarded, and Webb recognized the defensive reaction of a child who had been punished for things beyond his control. The boy's next words confirmed his suspicions about the psychological conditioning Harry had endured. "I don't mean to make the strange things happen," Harry said quietly. "I know they're my fault, and I try to stop them. But sometimes when I get scared or angry, they just happen anyway." Webb felt a flash of anger at the people who had convinced an 8-year-old that he was responsible for phenomena beyond any child's control. The psychological damage from years of being blamed for unexplained incidents would be severe and long-lasting. "Harry," Webb said carefully, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. Nothing that happens around you is your fault. You're a child, and children are never responsible for things that adults can't understand or control." The boy's eyes widened slightly, as if the concept of not being blamed for everything was foreign to his experience. Webb continued, choosing his words with the care of someone who understood that he might be providing the first positive adult guidance Harry had ever received. "Can you tell me about these incidents? Not because you're in trouble, but because understanding what happens might help us protect you better." Harry was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with years of conditioning that told him to never discuss the strange things that happened around him. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Sometimes when Uncle Vernon is really angry, all the lights in the house stop working. And when Aunt Petunia is being particularly mean, things in the kitchen start moving around on their own. I think maybe I make it happen when I'm upset, but I don't know how." Webb made careful notes, recognizing that Harry's description matched the patterns Whitman had documented. The boy's honesty about his experiences, combined with his obvious distress about being unable to control them, painted a picture of a child struggling with capabilities he didn't understand while being punished for their manifestations. "Has anyone ever tried to help you understand these abilities?" Webb asked gently. Harry's expression became confused. "Abilities? Uncle Vernon always said they were proof that I'm a freak, that there's something wrong with me. He said normal people don't make impossible things happen." The casual cruelty of that psychological conditioning made Webb's jaw tighten with suppressed anger. The Dursleys had taken a child's extraordinary capabilities and turned them into a source of shame and self-hatred, creating psychological trauma that would require years of therapy to address. "Harry, what if I told you that having unusual abilities doesn't make you a freak?" Webb said carefully. "What if the things that happen around you are actually signs that you're special in positive ways that the Dursleys didn't understand?" The hope that flickered in Harry's eyes was almost painful to witness, suggesting how desperately the boy wanted to believe that he wasn't fundamentally broken or dangerous. But Webb could also see the years of conditioning that made it difficult for Harry to accept any positive interpretation of his experiences. As they continued talking, Webb became increasingly convinced that Harry Potter was indeed a child with extraordinary capabilities who had been systematically abused by people who either feared or sought to suppress those abilities. The conspiracy to maintain him in that abusive situation suggested that powerful people understood exactly what Harry represented and had decided that his suffering was preferable to allowing his abilities to develop naturally. The interview was interrupted by commotion in the hallway outside Harry's room. Webb looked up to see hospital staff members gesturing urgently at something beyond his line of sight, their expressions mixing professional concern with obvious confusion. Dr. Chen appeared in the doorway, her face pale with a mixture of excitement and apprehension that suggested something significant had occurred. "Detective Inspector Webb," she said formally, "I need to speak with you immediately. We have a situation that requires your attention." Webb followed Dr. Chen into the hallway, leaving Whitman with Harry while they dealt with whatever crisis had developed. The doctor led him to a window overlooking the hospital's main parking area, where a scene was unfolding that challenged Webb's understanding of normal governmental procedure. 3 black vehicles with tinted windows had pulled up to the hospital's main entrance, and men in expensive suits were exiting with the coordinated efficiency of a well-trained team. They moved with the purpose and authority of governmental agents, but there were no visible agency identifications or official markings on their vehicles. "Who are they?" Webb asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "They claim to be from the Home Office," Dr. Chen replied, "but they're not following normal procedures for governmental oversight of medical facilities. They've demanded immediate access to Harry Potter and all medical records related to his case." Webb felt his investigative instincts sharpen into focus. The timing of this official intervention, coming so soon after his conversation with Harry, suggested that someone had been monitoring their investigation and had decided that direct action was necessary. "What exactly did they tell you?" he asked. The man in charge, who identified himself as some kind of senior civil servant, said that Harry Potter's case involves matters of national security that supersede normal child protection procedures. He indicated that they would be taking custody of the boy immediately, and that all records of his treatment here would be classified. Webb's jaw tightened with determination. Over the years, he had developed a deep suspicion of authority figures who invoked national security to avoid accountability, and the Potter case had all the hallmarks of a cover-up designed to protect people who should be facing criminal charges. "Dr. Chen," he said firmly, "I need you to refuse them access to Harry or his medical records until they provide proper legal documentation. This is still an active police investigation, and I won't allow anyone to interfere with our efforts to protect that boy." "But they claim to have authority that supersedes local police jurisdiction," Dr. Chen protested, though her expression suggested she agreed with Webb's position. "Then let them prove it in court," Webb replied grimly. "Until they produce properly executed legal orders, Harry Potter remains under the protection of Surrey Police, and I intend to make sure that protection is meaningful." As Webb returned to Harry's room, he realized that the investigation had reached a critical juncture. The mysterious authority figures Mrs. Figg had warned about were no longer operating from the shadows, and their direct intervention suggested that the conspiracy surrounding Harry Potter was both more extensive and more desperate than he had initially suspected. Whatever forces had condemned Harry to 8 years of abuse were not going to allow their carefully constructed system to be dismantled without a fight. But Webb had spent his career confronting people who believed their power placed them above the law, and he was prepared to use every resource at his disposal to ensure that justice was finally served for Harry Potter. The confrontation that would ultimately expose the wizarding world to Muggle authorities was about to begin, initiated by one detective inspector's refusal to be intimidated by claims of national security when a child's welfare was at stake. Inside Harry's room, the boy sat quietly by the window, unaware that his simple act of trusting R.P.C. Whitman with the truth about his situation had set in motion events that would reshape the hidden world that had failed him so completely. The investigation that had begun with a frightened child running through darkened streets was about to become something far larger and more significant than anyone could have imagined. Webb took a deep breath and prepared to face whatever consequences might come from challenging authority figures who preferred to operate in shadows and secrecy. Harry Potter deserved better than the conspiracy of silence that had enabled his abuse, and Webb was determined to ensure that everyone responsible would finally be held accountable for their actions, regardless of how powerful or well-connected they might be. The tall man in the immaculate dark suit who entered Harry's hospital room carried himself with the kind of quiet authority that suggested both governmental training and something deeper, more mysterious than ordinary bureaucratic power. Detective Inspector Webb sized him up immediately, recognizing the careful movements and alert posture of someone accustomed to dealing with dangerous situations, though this particular danger was unlike anything Webb had encountered in his career. The stranger's dark skin and calm demeanor gave no hint of the extraordinary abilities that lay beneath his professional exterior. He introduced himself as Kingsley Shacklebolt from a specialized department within the Home Office, though the vague nature of his credentials immediately raised Webb's suspicions. In 20 years of police work, Webb had learned to recognize when official authority was being used to conceal rather than reveal the truth. "Mr. Shacklebolt," Webb said, his tone politely professional, but with an edge that suggested he would not be easily intimidated. "I need to see proper documentation before I allow anyone to interfere with an active police investigation involving child welfare." Kingsley reached into his jacket with deliberate slowness, producing identification that bore official seals and security clearances Webb had never seen before. The documents were impressive in their apparent authenticity, but something about the entire situation felt wrong to the detective inspector's experienced instincts. "Detective Inspector Webb," Kingsley said, his voice carrying a subtle accent that was difficult to place. "I understand your concerns about the welfare of the child, but there are aspects of this case that involve matters of national security. Harry Potter's situation is more complex than your investigation has revealed." Webb glanced at P.C. Whitman, noting her skeptical expression and the protective way she had positioned herself between Harry and the mysterious official. The boy himself had gone very still, his green eyes wide with an alertness that suggested he sensed something unusual about their unexpected visitor. "What kind of national security matters?" Webb pressed, refusing to be deflected by vague official language. "Harry Potter is an 8-year-old abuse victim. What possible national security implications could his case involve?" Kingsley's expression remained carefully neutral, but Webb caught a flicker of something that might have been sympathy in the man's dark eyes. The internal conflict was subtle, but visible to someone trained in reading human behavior, suggesting that Kingsley was not entirely comfortable with whatever orders had brought him here. "I'm afraid the details are classified," Kingsley replied, though his tone suggested he wished he could provide more information. "What I can tell you is that Harry's placement with his relatives was arranged at the highest levels of government for his own protection and the security of the realm." The phrase "security of the realm" struck Webb as archaic and oddly formal, the kind of language more suited to historical documents than contemporary governmental operations. Combined with Kingsley's unusual credentials and the mysterious nature of his department, it suggested that Harry Potter's case involved agencies or authorities that operated outside normal governmental structures. "Protection?" Webb's voice sharpened with controlled anger. "Mr. Shacklebolt, Harry Potter has been systematically abused for 8 years. If that's your definition of protection, I'd hate to see what you consider endangerment." Harry spoke up for the first time since Kingsley had entered the room, his voice small but carrying a note of recognition that surprised everyone present. "You're like me, aren't you?" the boy said quietly, his gaze fixed on Kingsley with an intensity that made the adults in the room suddenly alert to undercurrents they didn't understand. Kingsley's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly, and Webb saw genuine surprise and concern cross his features. The reaction was subtle but unmistakable, suggesting that Harry had identified something about their visitor that wasn't apparent to the Muggle observers. "What do you mean, Harry?" Kingsley asked gently, his official demeanor softening into something more personal and protective. "You can make things happen too, can't you?" Harry continued, his childish directness cutting through the diplomatic language that had characterized the adult conversation. "The strange things that happen around me, you understand them because they happen around you too." Webb felt the hair on the back of his neck rise as he recognized the implications of what Harry was suggesting. If the boy was correct, then Kingsley Shacklebolt possessed the same unexplained abilities that had made Harry a target for abuse and governmental interest. "Mr. Shacklebolt," Webb said carefully, "I think you need to explain exactly what kind of abilities you're talking about and how they relate to the phenomena we've documented around Harry." Kingsley looked genuinely conflicted, glancing between Harry's hopeful face and the determined expressions of the police officers who had become the boy's protectors. Whatever instructions he had received clearly hadn't anticipated this level of investigation or Harry's perceptive recognition of a kindred spirit. Before Kingsley could respond, the lights in Harry's room began to flicker erratically. The boy's emotional state, elevated by the recognition that he might not be alone in his strangeness, was triggering the same phenomena that had plagued him throughout his stay at the hospital. "Harry, it's all right. P.C., Whitman said soothingly, moving closer to the boy in an attempt to calm him before the electrical disturbances spread beyond his room. But Harry was beyond soothing. 8 years of believing himself to be a dangerous freak, followed by the sudden possibility that he wasn't alone in the world, had created an emotional storm that his untrained abilities couldn't contain. The flickering lights intensified, and electronic equipment throughout the pediatric ward began to malfunction. Kingsley watched the developing situation with obvious concern, his official mission clearly at war with his personal sympathy for a child whose abilities were spiraling out of control. Webb could see the moment when Kingsley made a decision that would change everything. "Harry," Kingsley said firmly, stepping closer to the boy despite the electrical disturbances, "you need to focus on my voice and try to calm down. What you're experiencing is natural, but you need to learn to control it." The use of the word natural, rather than abnormal or dangerous, had an immediate effect on Harry. The boy's desperate attention focused on Kingsley as if he were a lifeline in a storm of confusion and fear. "It's natural?" Harry whispered, his voice full of desperate hope. "Completely natural," Kingsley confirmed, his professional caution giving way to compassion for a child who had been systematically taught to hate himself for gifts he couldn't understand or control. Webb and Whitman watched in fascination as Kingsley began speaking to Harry in low, soothing tones, explaining concepts that seemed impossible, but that clearly resonated with the boy's experience. The electrical disturbances gradually subsided as Harry's emotional state stabilized, but the implications of what they were witnessing were staggering. "Mr. Shacklebolt," Webb said quietly, "I think it's time you told us the complete truth about what's going on here." Kingsley was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his options and the consequences of whatever decision he made. When he finally spoke, his words would begin the process of revealing a hidden world that had remained secret for centuries. "Detective Inspector Webb, what I'm about to tell you will challenge everything you think you know about the nature of reality. Harry Potter is not simply a child with unusual abilities. He is a wizard, a member of a magical community that has existed alongside your world for thousands of years." The silence that followed this revelation was profound and charged with disbelief. Webb's rational mind immediately rejected the concept of magic as fantasy, but the evidence he had documented over the past few days made it impossible to dismiss Kingsley's claim entirely. "Magic," Webb repeated slowly, his tone carefully neutral, despite the tumult of thoughts racing through his mind. "Magic," Kingsley confirmed. "Harry was born into our world, the son of two powerful wizards who died protecting him from a dark wizard of extraordinary malevolence. His placement with his Muggle relatives was arranged by the leader of our community for his protection, though I'm beginning to suspect that the arrangement was flawed from the beginning." P.C. Whitman found her voice first, her practical police training reasserting itself, despite the extraordinary nature of what she was hearing. "Mr. Shacklebolt, are you telling us that there's an entire community of people with magical abilities that operates in secret alongside normal society?" "We prefer the term magical community rather than normal society," Kingsley said with a slight smile, "though I understand the distinction you're making. And yes, we have maintained our secrecy for centuries through laws that govern our interaction with the non-magical world." Webb's investigative instincts immediately focused on the implications of this revelation. If Kingsley was telling the truth, then Harry's abuse had been sanctioned not just by governmental authorities, but by an entirely separate society, with its own laws and power structures. And Harry's placement with abusive relatives was approved by your magical authorities? Webb asked, his anger at the systemic failures becoming clearer and more focused. Kingsley's expression grew troubled. The decision was made by Albus Dumbledore, the chief warlock of our governing body and widely considered the most powerful wizard of our time. He believed that placing Harry with his mother's blood relatives would provide magical protection that outweighed any concerns about their suitability as guardians. The casual way Kingsley mentioned magical protection, as if it were an accepted fact, rather than an impossible concept, struck Webb as either evidence of elaborate delusion or confirmation that they were dealing with forces beyond conventional understanding. Harry's reaction settled the question. "Professor Dumbledore knew the Dursleys would hurt me?" Harry asked, his voice small and wounded, in a way that cut through every adult's heart in the room. Kingsley knelt down beside Harry's bed, his expression gentle but honest. I don't think he understood how badly they would treat you, Harry. Professor Dumbledore is a good man who has spent his life protecting our community, but I fear he may have prioritized your physical safety over your emotional well-being." "That's not good enough," Webb said flatly, his police training rejecting any excuse for child endangerment, regardless of the magical context. If this Dumbledore character placed Harry in an abusive situation, he needs to be held accountable under the law. "Which law?" Kingsley asked quietly. "Ours or yours?" Harry exists at the intersection of both worlds, and that has created complications that neither system was designed to handle. The question highlighted the jurisdictional nightmare that Harry's case represented. If the magical community operated under its own legal system, then the abuse Harry had suffered might fall into a grey area where neither magical nor Muggle authorities felt fully responsible for his protection. "Mr. Shacklebolt," P.C. Whitman interjected, "regardless of which legal system applies, Harry is a British citizen who has been the victim of serious crimes. Those crimes were committed on British soil by British subjects, which makes them subject to British law regardless of any magical considerations." Kingsley nodded approvingly, clearly impressed by Whitman's logical approach to the jurisdictional complexities. "You're absolutely correct, Constable. The challenge is that our two communities have very different approaches to justice and child welfare, and Harry's case may require unprecedented cooperation between them." Webb leaned forward, his expression focused and determined. "Mr. Shacklebolt, I need you to understand something very clearly. Surrey Police will not abandon Harry Potter to a system that has already failed him once, magical or otherwise. If your community wants to claim jurisdiction over his case, they'll need to demonstrate that they can provide better protection than we can." The detective inspector's words carried the weight of absolute conviction, and Kingsley recognized that he was dealing with Muggle authorities who would not be easily intimidated or deflected. The careful balance between magical secrecy and child welfare had been irrevocably disrupted, and new solutions would be required. "I understand your position, Detective Inspector, and I respect it," Kingsley said carefully. "But you need to understand that Harry's case involves dangers that extend far beyond the abuse he suffered with his relatives. There are magical threats to his safety that your world cannot protect him from." As if summoned by Kingsley's words, the hospital's public address system crackled to life with an announcement that would prove his point in the most dramatic way possible. The voice that echoed through the corridors was crisp and professional, but the message it carried was anything but routine. "All staff and visitors, please remain calm and await further instructions. We are experiencing technical difficulties that may affect electronic systems throughout the facility." Webb looked out the window toward the parking lot and saw that the situation was far more complex than a simple technical malfunction. Every car in the hospital parking lot had its alarm system activated, creating a cacophony of sound that could be heard even through the building's walls. Streetlights along the surrounding roads were flickering erratically, and electronic billboards in the distance were displaying scrambled, incomprehensible messages. "Harry," Webb said gently, "are you causing this?" The boy shook his head, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. "I don't think so. This feels different from when I make things happen. It's bigger and more frightened." "Frightened?" Kingsley repeated sharply, his professional alertness suddenly focused on implications that the Muggle authorities couldn't yet understand. "It feels like something scared is trying to hide," Harry explained, his unusual sensitivity to magical phenomena providing insights that even trained wizards might miss. Like it knows people are looking for it, and it's trying to make them stop. Kingsley's expression grew grim as he recognized the implications of Harry's observation. If the boy's magical sensitivity was accurate, then they were witnessing the response of a magical entity or system that felt threatened by the investigation and was attempting to discourage further inquiry through technological disruption. "Detective Inspector Webb," Kingsley said urgently, "I believe we're experiencing magical interference designed to prevent your investigation from continuing. Someone or something in my world views your work as a threat and is taking action to stop it. Webb felt a cold satisfaction at this confirmation of his suspicions. Throughout his career, he had learned that the most vigorous attempts to shut down an investigation usually indicated that the investigators were getting close to something important. If the magical community was willing to risk exposure through such obvious intervention, then Harry's case must threaten powerful people or institutions within that hidden world. "Mr. Shacklebolt," Webb said grimly, "if someone is trying to intimidate us into abandoning this investigation, they've chosen exactly the wrong approach. Surrey Police does not respond well to threats, magical or otherwise. The electrical disturbances intensified, as if responding to Webb's defiant words, but the detective inspector remained unmoved by the display of supernatural power. He had spent his career confronting people who believed their authority or resources placed them above the law, and magical abilities were simply a new variation on an old theme. "Constable Whitman," Webb ordered, "I want you to document everything that's happening here. If the magical community wants to interfere with a legitimate police investigation, they can explain their actions in court." "Sir," Whitman replied, already making notes in her official pad, "what if the courts can't handle evidence involving magic?" "Then we'll find courts that can," Webb said firmly. "Or we'll create new legal frameworks specifically designed to address crimes that involve magical elements. Harry Potter deserves justice, and we're going to make sure he gets it, regardless of how many impossible things we have to accept in the process." Kingsley watched the two police officers with growing respect and concern. Their refusal to be intimidated by magical phenomena was admirable from a personal standpoint, but it also represented a threat to the statute of secrecy that had protected the wizarding world for centuries. If Muggle authorities began systematically investigating magical crimes, the careful separation between the two worlds would collapse. "Detective Inspector Webb," Kingsley said carefully, "I need to contact my superiors and inform them of this development. The situation has moved beyond my authority to manage, and decisions will need to be made at the highest levels of our government." "Your superiors can contact me directly," Webb replied. "Surrey Police will be happy to cooperate with any properly constituted magical authority, but we won't be dismissed or ignored when a child's welfare is at stake." As Kingsley prepared to leave the hospital, the electronic disturbances began to subside, suggesting that whoever or whatever had been attempting to disrupt the investigation had either given up or decided on a different approach. The sudden return to normal operation felt almost ominous, as if the calm were merely a preparation for a larger storm. Harry remained quiet throughout this exchange, but his expression showed a mixture of hope and apprehension that reflected his growing understanding of the forces that had shaped his young life. For the first time, he was seeing adults who were willing to fight for his welfare regardless of the obstacles they might face. But he was also beginning to comprehend the larger conflict that his case represented. P.C. Whitman approached Harry's bedside, her manner gentle but purposeful. "Harry," she said softly, "I want you to know that Detective Inspector Webb and I are not going to let anyone hurt you again, magical or otherwise. You're under the protection of Surrey Police, and that means something." Harry looked up at her with the desperate gratitude of a child who had never experienced unconditional adult protection. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice carrying years of accumulated hope that someone might finally care enough to fight for him. Webb watched the interaction with satisfaction, recognizing that they had crossed a line from which there could be no retreat. Harry Potter had become more than just a case to him and his officers. He had become a symbol of every child who had been failed by systems that prioritized institutional interests over individual welfare. The investigation that had begun with a frightened boy running through darkened streets had evolved into something far larger and more significant. Two worlds that had maintained careful separation for centuries were about to collide, initiated by Muggle police officers who refused to accept magical authority as an excuse for child abuse. As evening settled over the hospital, Webb began planning the next phase of an investigation that would ultimately reshape the relationship between the magical and non-magical worlds. Harry Potter's case had become the catalyst for changes that would ensure no child, magical or otherwise, would ever again be sacrificed for the supposed greater good. The collision between worlds had begun, and Detective Inspector Marcus Webb was determined to emerge victorious in the battle for Harry Potter's future and the principles of justice that he had spent his career defending. The emergency session at 10 Downing Street convened at midnight, bringing together individuals whose very presence in the same room would have seemed impossible to anyone outside the highest echelons of British government. Prime Minister Margaret Thorne sat at the head of the polished conference table, her expression grave as she absorbed briefing documents that challenged every assumption she had made about the nature of reality and governance during her tenure in office. Cornelius Fudge, Minister for Magic, occupied the chair to her right with the nervous energy of a man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. His bowler hat sat precisely on the table beside a stack of magical documents that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves when no one was looking directly at them. The contrast between his old-fashioned appearance and the cutting-edge technology that surrounded the Prime Minister's conference room highlighted the collision between two worlds that had maintained separation for centuries. The crisis had escalated beyond anyone's ability to contain through traditional channels when Detective Inspector Webb's investigation had attracted the attention of international intelligence agencies. Reports of unexplained electromagnetic phenomena centered on a Surrey hospital had reached the desks of security officials in 3 countries, prompting urgent questions about British capabilities in areas that officially didn't exist. Prime Minister Thorne looked across the table at Kingsley Shacklebolt, whose dual role as both a senior ministry official and the wizard who had made first contact with Muggle authorities placed him at the center of an unprecedented diplomatic crisis. His calm demeanor provided a stark contrast to Fudge's obvious agitation, suggesting a man who had spent considerable time thinking about the implications of magical Muggle integration. "Mr. Shacklebolt," the Prime Minister began, her tone carrying the weight of someone accustomed to managing international crises. "I need you to explain to me how a routine child abuse investigation has escalated into a threat to national security and international relations." Kingsley straightened in his chair, his expression respectful but candid. "Prime Minister, the situation arose because Harry Potter's case represents the intersection of 2 critical failures. The wizarding world failed to protect a child from abuse, and the Muggle world discovered that failure through competent police work that we could not suppress or redirect." Fudge shifted uncomfortably, his face flushing with the indignation of a man who had built his career on maintaining the status quo. The situation could have been managed quietly if the Muggle authorities had been more cooperative, he interjected. "We offered them standard memory modifications and alternative explanations, but they refused to accept our assistance." "They refused to allow you to cover up child abuse," Kingsley corrected, his tone remaining diplomatic despite the obvious tension between the 2 magical officials. Detective Inspector Webb and P.C. Whitman are exemplary officers who prioritized a child's welfare over institutional convenience, and they deserve our respect rather than our criticism. The Prime Minister raised a hand to forestall further argument between her magical advisers, her attention focused on the broader implications of the crisis rather than the personalities involved. "Mr. Fudge, I need to understand the scope of this problem. How many people now have direct knowledge of the wizarding world's existence?" Fudge consulted a document that appeared to be written on parchment with a quill pen, an anachronism that emphasized the cultural gap between the 2 governmental systems. "Currently, we estimate that 12 Muggle individuals have detailed knowledge that cannot be easily explained away or modified. This includes medical staff, police officers, and social services personnel who have documented extensive evidence of magical phenomena. The number was far larger than anything the wizarding world had dealt with in living memory, representing a breach of secrecy that threatened the fundamental structure of magical society. Previous incidents had typically involved 1 or 2 individuals who could be memory modified or discredited, but the systematic nature of the investigation into Harry Potter's case had created a documented trail that involved too many credible witnesses to dismiss. And international attention? The Prime Minister pressed, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer would be troubling. Kingsley took over the briefing, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the full scope of the diplomatic crisis they were facing. The electromagnetic disturbances associated with magical interference have been detected by monitoring stations in France, Germany, and the United States. Our international magical colleagues are demanding explanations for what appears to be uncontrolled magical discharge on an unprecedented scale. The Prime Minister absorbed this information with the stoic expression of someone who had weathered multiple governmental crises, but the magnitude of this particular situation was clearly testing even her considerable experience. So we have both domestic exposure and international scrutiny, she summarized. What are our options for managing this crisis? Fudge leaned forward eagerly, his expression showing the desperate hope of someone who still believed in traditional solutions. We could attempt large-scale memory modification, though the number of individuals involved makes success uncertain. Alternatively, we could discredit the witnesses by suggesting mass hallucination or psychological manipulation. The Prime Minister's expression grew cold at the suggestion of discrediting police officers and medical professionals who had been doing their jobs competently and ethically. Mr. Fudge, I will not allow my government to participate in undermining the credibility of public servants who are protecting a child from abuse. Find me alternatives that don't involve destroying innocent careers. Kingsley cleared his throat respectfully, drawing attention to himself with the manner of someone who had been preparing for this moment throughout his career. Prime Minister, there is another option that we should consider, though it represents a fundamental departure from centuries of magical tradition. Both the Prime Minister and Fudge looked at him expectantly, though their expressions suggested very different hopes about what he might propose. We could choose controlled disclosure, Kingsley continued, his voice steady despite the revolutionary nature of what he was suggesting. Rather than attempting to suppress knowledge that has already been documented and distributed, we could work with Muggle authorities to manage a gradual integration process that protects both communities while ensuring that children like Harry Potter receive proper protection. The suggestion sent Fudge into immediate panic. Controlled disclosure would mean the end of the wizarding world as we know it, he sputtered. The statute of secrecy has protected us for centuries. We cannot simply abandon it because of one difficult case. The statute of secrecy has also enabled the systematic abuse of a child whose only crime was being born into both worlds, Kingsley replied with quiet intensity. If our traditions require us to sacrifice children for institutional convenience, then perhaps those traditions need to be reconsidered. The argument that followed revealed the fundamental philosophical divide within the wizarding world about their relationship with Muggle society. Fudge represented the traditionalist view that magical secrecy was essential for wizard survival, while Kingsley advocated for a more integrated approach that prioritized individual welfare over institutional protection. The Prime Minister listened to both sides with the attention of someone who understood that the decision they reached would have implications far beyond British borders. The existence of a hidden magical community raised questions about sovereignty, citizenship, legal jurisdiction, and international relations that would require unprecedented cooperation between governmental systems. Mr. Shacklebolt, she said finally, what would controlled disclosure actually involve? I need concrete proposals, not theoretical discussions about integration. Kingsley opened a folder containing documents that represented months of careful planning, suggesting that he had been preparing for this conversation long before the current crisis had forced it upon them. The basic framework would involve establishing joint oversight committees for cases that affect both communities, beginning with child welfare and expanding to other areas as trust and cooperation develop. He spread the documents across the table, revealing detailed proposals for magical Muggle cooperation in law enforcement, healthcare, and education. The scope of his preparation was impressive, indicating a level of forward thinking that neither Fudge nor the Prime Minister had anticipated. We would start small, with pilot programs in selected regions where both communities have strong institutional foundations, Kingsley explained. Surrey is actually ideal for this purpose, given the competence of the local police force and the fact that they've already demonstrated their ability to handle magical phenomena responsibly. The Prime Minister studied the documents with the focused attention of someone who had spent her career evaluating policy proposals. The framework was comprehensive but gradual, designed to minimize disruption to both communities, while establishing the institutional foundations for long-term cooperation. "What about the international implications?" she asked, her mind immediately jumping to the diplomatic complexities that would arise from unilateral British action on such a significant issue. "That's where the situation actually works in our favor," Kingsley replied with a slight smile. "The magical communities in other countries have been watching our handling of this crisis with great interest. Many of them face similar challenges with the intersection of magical and Muggle child welfare systems. The suggestion that other magical governments might welcome controlled disclosure came as a surprise to both the Prime Minister and Fudge, though for very different reasons. Fudge had assumed that international magical opinion would be uniformly opposed to any breach of secrecy, while the Prime Minister had worried about the diplomatic consequences of unilateral action. "You're suggesting this could become an international initiative?" the Prime Minister asked, recognizing the potential advantages of multinational cooperation in managing such a significant change. "The French ministry has already indicated interest in joint programs for Muggle-born witch and wizard support," Kingsley confirmed. "The Americans have been developing integration protocols for cases involving national security implications. The framework exists. It simply needs British leadership to implement it." As the discussion continued through the early morning hours, the shape of a revolutionary new approach to magical-Muggle relations began to emerge. The crisis created by Harry Potter's case had revealed fundamental flaws in the traditional approach to magical secrecy, but it had also provided an opportunity to address those flaws through unprecedented cooperation between communities that had maintained separation for centuries. The Prime Minister found herself impressed by Kingsley's vision and preparation, recognizing the kind of strategic thinking that had made him valuable to both magical and Muggle authorities. His proposals were ambitious but practical, addressing legitimate security concerns while prioritizing the welfare of individuals caught between two worlds. "Mr. Fudge," she said finally, "I need your honest assessment of the wizarding world's readiness for this kind of change." Fudge squirmed uncomfortably, clearly torn between his traditional instincts and his recognition that the current crisis required extraordinary solutions. "The magical community is deeply conservative, Prime Minister. Change of this magnitude would face significant resistance from established families and traditional institutions. But you would have the support of law enforcement and child welfare advocates," Kingsley interjected. "The crisis has revealed problems that many of us have recognized for years, but lacked the authority to address. Harry Potter's case provides the catalyst for reforms that are long overdue." The Prime Minister made her decision with the decisiveness that had characterized her rise to political leadership. "Mr. Shacklebolt, I want you to return to Surrey and work directly with Detective Inspector Webb to establish the framework for joint magical-Muggle oversight of Harry Potter's case. This will serve as our pilot program for the larger integration initiative you've outlined." She turned to Fudge, her expression carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Mr. Fudge, I need your full cooperation with this initiative, regardless of your personal reservations. The alternative is a complete breakdown of magical secrecy with no controlled management, and I don't think either of our communities wants that outcome." Fudge nodded reluctantly, recognizing that his options had been reduced to supporting controlled change or facing uncontrolled chaos. "Very well, Prime Minister, but I want it clearly understood that this represents an experimental program, not a permanent abandonment of traditional magical secrecy." The experimental nature of the program was actually one of its strengths, allowing both communities to proceed cautiously while maintaining the flexibility to modify their approach based on early results. The Prime Minister recognized this as a diplomatic solution that provided face-saving options for traditionalists while enabling the fundamental reforms that the crisis had revealed to be necessary. As the meeting concluded, Kingsley felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension about the task ahead. The framework for magical Muggle integration had been established at the highest levels of government, but the real work would involve implementing that framework at the operational level, where individual lives hung in the balance. The return journey to Surrey took place in the grey light of early dawn, with Kingsley reflecting on the extraordinary chain of events that had brought two worlds to this historic moment of cooperation. Harry Potter's desperate flight from Privet Drive had triggered changes that would reshape magical society's relationship with the broader world, demonstrating how individual courage could catalyze institutional transformation. At the hospital, Detective Inspector Webb and P.C. Whitman were waiting with the professional alertness of officers who had spent the night preparing for whatever developments the morning might bring. Their dedication to Harry Potter's welfare had remained constant throughout the crisis, providing a foundation of moral clarity that had guided the larger policy discussions in London. "Detective Inspector Webb," Kingsley announced as he entered Harry's room, "I'm authorized to inform you that Her Majesty's government recognizes the joint jurisdiction of Muggle and magical authorities in cases involving citizens of both communities. Harry Potter's case will proceed under combined oversight, with full cooperation between our legal systems." Webb's expression showed satisfaction rather than surprise, suggesting that he had anticipated this outcome from the moment he committed to pursuing justice, regardless of the obstacles involved. "Excellent, Mr. Shacklebolt. When do we begin the formal cooperation?" "Immediately," Kingsley replied with a smile. "I've been instructed to work directly with Surrey Police to establish protocols that will ensure Harry receives the protection and support he deserves from both communities." Harry had been listening to this exchange with the wide-eyed attention of a child who was beginning to understand that adults were finally taking his welfare seriously. The transformation from victim to protected citizen was still difficult for him to process, but the commitment of his protectors was becoming increasingly clear. "Does this mean I won't have to go back to the Dursleys?" Harry asked, his voice carrying hope tempered by years of disappointed expectations. "You will never be placed in an abusive situation again," Webb assured him, with the absolute conviction of someone whose professional reputation depended on keeping such promises. "Both magical and Muggle authorities are now committed to ensuring your safety and well-being." As the first joint magical Muggle child protection case in British history officially began, Harry Potter found himself at the center of changes that would ultimately transform two entire communities. The frightened boy who had fled through darkened streets had become the catalyst for unprecedented cooperation between worlds that had maintained separation for centuries. The investigation that had begun with a dedicated police constable's refusal to ignore a child in need had evolved into something far larger and more significant than anyone could have anticipated. Harry Potter's case would set precedents for magical Muggle cooperation that would ensure no child would ever again be sacrificed for the supposed greater good, regardless of which world they belonged to. The revolution in magical Muggle relations had begun, initiated by the simple principle that every child deserved protection, and every investigation deserved to follow the evidence wherever it might lead, no matter how impossible the destination might initially appear. The Joint Task Force headquarters, established in a repurposed conference room at Surrey Police Station, represented the first official collaboration between magical and Muggle law enforcement in recorded history. Detective Inspector Webb surveyed the unusual collection of personnel that had assembled over the past week, noting how quickly both communities had adapted to working alongside colleagues whose methods and capabilities challenged everything they thought they knew about investigative work. Arthur Weasley sat at one end of the polished conference table, his enthusiasm for Muggle technology barely contained as he examined the electronic equipment that filled the room. His genuine fascination with devices that Muggles took for granted provided a refreshing counterpoint to the more serious work of cataloguing systematic failures in child protection across both worlds. Webb had quickly learned to appreciate Arthur's unique perspective on magical Muggle integration, recognizing in him a kindred spirit who prioritized curiosity over tradition. PC Sarah Whitman occupied her usual position near the evidence boards that now covered 3 walls of the room, her methodical documentation of the Potter case having expanded into a comprehensive overview of institutional failures that spanned both communities. Her partnership with Aura Nymphadora Tonks had proven surprisingly effective, combining Muggle investigative techniques with magical forensics in ways that revealed evidence neither approach could have uncovered alone. Tonks herself represented everything that was innovative about the new cooperative model. Her Morphmagus abilities allowed her to conduct undercover investigations in both worlds with unprecedented effectiveness, while her irreverent attitude toward traditional magical authority made her an ideal bridge between the formal structures of both law enforcement communities. Webb found her combination of competence and humor invaluable for maintaining morale during the difficult work of exposing systemic abuse. The morning briefing began with reports from multiple ongoing investigations that had emerged from Harry Potter's initial case. What had started as a single child abuse situation had metastasized into a comprehensive review of child protection failures that reached into the highest levels of both magical and Muggle society. Dr. Elizabeth Chen entered the room carrying a thick folder of medical reports that represented weeks of careful research into the magical children who had passed through her hospital over the years. Her systematic review of unexplained medical phenomena had identified dozens of cases where magical abilities had been misdiagnosed, suppressed, or ignored, resulting in inappropriate treatment and missed opportunities for proper support. "Detective Inspector Webb," Dr. Chen announced, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a researcher who had uncovered significant patterns. "I've completed the comprehensive review of pediatric cases involving unexplained phenomena over the past decade. The results are more extensive than we initially suspected." She spread multiple charts across the table, each documenting a case where a child with emerging magical abilities had been failed by systems that didn't understand or acknowledge their true nature. The patterns were consistent and damning: isolation, misdiagnosis, inappropriate medication, and family breakdown that could have been prevented with proper magical Muggle cooperation. "How many children are we talking about?" Webb asked, though his expression suggested he was prepared for a disturbing answer. 43 confirmed cases in Surrey alone," Dr. Chen replied grimly. "And that's only counting children who came to official medical attention. The actual number is likely much higher, considering how many families struggle with unexplained phenomena without seeking help." Arthur Weasley leaned forward, his expression troubled by implications that extended far beyond medical misdiagnosis. "Dr. Chen, have you been able to determine why these children weren't identified and supported by magical authorities?" "That's the most disturbing aspect of my findings," Dr. Chen continued, opening another section of her comprehensive report. "In 12 of these cases, I found evidence that magical authorities were aware of the children's abilities, but chose not to intervene because they were living in Muggle households. The silence that followed this revelation was charged with anger and disbelief. The systematic nature of the abandonment suggested institutional policies rather than individual failures, indicating that Harry Potter's case was part of a broader pattern of neglect that had affected dozens of magical children over the years. PC Whitman broke the silence with the practical focus of an investigator who had learned to channel outrage into effective action. "Dr. Chen, do we have contact information for these families? They need to know that support and resources are now available." "Most of them," Dr. Chen confirmed, "though approaching them will require careful consideration of their previous experiences with both magical and Muggle authorities. These families have learned to distrust official intervention and rebuilding that trust will take time and demonstrated competence. Tonks shifted in her chair, her hair unconsciously changing to a darker shade that reflected her serious mood. The trust issue goes beyond individual families, she observed. Word is spreading through both communities about the joint task force, and reactions are mixed. Some people see it as long overdue reform, while others view it as a dangerous abandonment of traditional protections. Webb nodded acknowledgement of the political complexities that surrounded their work. The task force existed in a delicate balance between innovation and tradition, requiring constant navigation of competing interests and deeply held beliefs about how the two worlds should relate to each other. The morning's second major briefing came from the financial investigation team that had been tracing the mysterious payments to the Dursleys and other families involved in magical child placements. Senior investigator Patricia Mills from the Serious Fraud Office had been working alongside Gringotts Bank representatives to uncover a financial network that spanned both worlds and multiple countries. Detective Inspector Webb, Investigator Mills announced, "We've uncovered evidence of systematic financial fraud involving the placement of magical children in Muggle households. The scope of the operation is international, with connections to similar programs in at least 6 other countries." She activated a projection system that displayed a complex web of financial connections linking shell companies, offshore accounts, and payments to families across Europe and North America. The sophistication of the money laundering operation suggested institutional support at the highest levels of magical governments. The Dursleys were receiving payments equivalent to £30,000 annually, Mills continued, but they represent only one node in a much larger network. We've identified similar payment patterns to families in France, Germany, Italy, Canada, and the United States. Arthur Weasley studied the financial diagrams with the focused attention of someone who understood the implications of such widespread coordination. This suggests that Harry's placement wasn't an isolated decision by Dumbledore, he said quietly. It was part of an international program for managing magical children born into Muggle families. The revelation that Harry's abuse was part of a systematic international program sent shockwaves through the assembled investigators. What they had initially understood as a single case of institutional failure was actually evidence of a coordinated policy that had affected magical children across multiple countries and generations. Investigator Mills continued her briefing with details that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of institutional coordination. The payments were structured to provide families with sufficient incentive to accept magical children while maintaining plausible deniability about the true source of the funds. The families involved were carefully selected based on their isolation from magical communities and their willingness to maintain strict secrecy about unusual phenomena. Most disturbing of all was the evidence that suggested the program included built-in acceptance of abuse and neglect as inevitable byproducts of placing magical children in households that feared and resented their abilities. The financial structure included provisions for increased payments when children displayed behavioral problems, creating perverse incentives for harsh treatment. Dr. Chen's medical evidence combined with Investigator Mills' financial research painted a picture of systematic child endangerment that operated with the knowledge and tacit approval of magical governments around the world. The scope of the institutional failure was staggering, affecting potentially hundreds of children over multiple generations. Webb absorbed this information with the grim determination of an investigator who had uncovered evidence of crimes that demanded justice regardless of their complexity or the power of those involved. The magnitude of the conspiracy actually strengthened his resolve rather than intimidating him, confirming his belief that systematic abuses required systematic responses. The afternoon session focused on individual cases that illustrated the broader patterns the task force had identified. Hermione Granger's parents, Dan and Emma Granger, had been contacted as part of the comprehensive review and had agreed to share their experiences with magical authorities and their daughter's education at Hogwarts. The Grangers' testimony provided crucial insights into the experiences of Muggle families dealing with magical children without adequate support or understanding. Their initial bewilderment at Hermione's abilities had been compounded by the magical community's failure to provide comprehensive information about what their daughter would face at school or how they could support her development. Dr. Granger, a dentist with a methodical approach to understanding complex systems, had prepared detailed notes about the inconsistencies and gaps in the information provided by Hogwarts and the Ministry of Magic. His professional training in patient care had made him particularly aware of the ways magical authorities failed to consider the impact of their policies on families. "We were told that Hermione was a witch and that she would attend a special school," Dr. Granger explained to the assembled task force. "But we were given virtually no information about magical society, the dangers she might face, or how we could support her while she was away from home." Mrs. Granger, a professor of literature with expertise in educational systems, had observed problems with Hogwarts' approach to Muggle-born students that reflected broader institutional failures in magical education. The school's assumption that magical children could simply abandon their Muggle identities ignored the psychological and social complexities of straddling two worlds. "Hermione has been struggling with identity issues that the school seems completely unprepared to address," Mrs. Granger continued. "She's caught between two worlds, fully accepted by neither, and the adults who should be supporting her don't seem to understand the challenges she faces." Arthur Weasley listened to the Grangers' testimony with visible distress, recognizing institutional failures that he had witnessed but never fully understood from his position within the magical community. His genuine concern for Muggle magical relations had been limited by his lack of direct contact with affected families, and the Grangers' experiences opened his eyes to problems he had never considered. The testimony session continued with reports from other families who had been contacted through Dr. Chen's medical research. Each story added another layer to the comprehensive picture of systematic failure that had emerged from Harry Potter's case. The Roberts family had struggled for years with their son's uncontrolled magical outbursts, receiving no support from authorities who either didn't believe their reports or chose not to acknowledge them. The isolation and fear they experienced had nearly destroyed their family relationships before the task force made contact and provided access to magical counseling services. The Martinez family had been told their daughter's abilities were a form of mental illness and had spent thousands of pounds on inappropriate medical treatments that not only failed to help, but actively made her condition worse. The psychological damage from years of being told she was mentally ill had created trauma that would require extensive therapy to address. Each case revealed the same patterns of institutional failure: abandonment, misinformation, inappropriate treatment, and systematic disregard for the welfare of magical children and their families. The evidence painted a picture of negligence so comprehensive that it could only have resulted from deliberate policy decisions at the highest levels of magical government. As the day progressed, the task force began developing comprehensive recommendations for reform that would address the systematic problems they had identified. The proposals were ambitious in scope, calling for fundamental changes in how magical and Muggle authorities approached child welfare, education, and family support. The educational reforms were particularly extensive, proposing joint magical Muggle schools that would allow children to maintain connections with both communities while receiving appropriate training in their abilities. The model would address the identity issues that had affected students like Hermione, while providing Muggle families with ongoing support and involvement in their children's magical education. Medical integration represented another crucial area of reform, with proposals for joint training programs that would prepare both magical and Muggle healthcare providers to recognize and treat children with emerging magical abilities. Dr. Chen's research had demonstrated the urgent need for medical professionals who understood the intersection of magical and physical health. Legal reform proposals addressed the jurisdictional complexities that had allowed systematic abuse to continue unchecked. The framework called for joint magical Muggle courts with jurisdiction over crimes affecting both communities, ensuring that perpetrators could not escape justice by exploiting the gaps between legal systems. As evening approached, Webb reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred over the past weeks. What had begun as a routine missing child investigation had evolved into a comprehensive review of institutional failures that spanned 2 worlds and multiple countries. The evidence they had gathered demanded fundamental reforms that would reshape magical Muggle relations for generations to come. Harry Potter's case had become the catalyst for changes that would ensure no child would ever again be abandoned to abuse, because they existed at the intersection of magical and Muggle worlds. The frightened boy who had fled through darkened streets had become the symbol of every child who had been failed by systems that prioritized institutional convenience over individual welfare. The Joint Task Force had demonstrated that cooperation between magical and Muggle authorities was not only possible, but essential for protecting vulnerable populations that neither community could adequately serve alone. Their work had established precedents and procedures that would guide future collaboration, while ensuring accountability and transparency in all aspects of child welfare. As Webb prepared to brief senior officials on their findings and recommendations, he felt a profound satisfaction that came from knowing their investigation had uncovered truth that powerful people had preferred to keep hidden. The evidence was comprehensive, the patterns were clear, and the need for reform was undeniable. Harry Potter would never return to the cupboard under the stairs, and dozens of other magical children would receive the support and protection they deserved. The institutional failures that had enabled systematic abuse were being exposed and addressed through unprecedented cooperation between communities that had maintained separation for far too long. The revolution in child protection had begun with one police constable's refusal to ignore a child in need, and it would continue until every magical child had access to the safety, support, and opportunities they deserved, regardless of which world they called home. The ancient courtroom of the Wizengamot had witnessed many historic trials throughout its centuries of existence, but none had attracted the level of scrutiny and controversy that surrounded the proceedings against Albus Percival, Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. The circular chamber, with its tiered stone benches and formal Gothic architecture, seemed almost too small to contain the magnitude of the charges being presented and the implications they carried for the future of magical society. Chief Warlock Amelia Bones presided over the trial with the stern dignity that had made her one of the most respected figures in magical law enforcement. Her decision to recuse the normal Chief Warlock position due to Dumbledore's conflict of interest had been controversial but necessary, establishing the independence and integrity that the proceedings required. The scarred oak bench from which she directed the trial bore the weight of centuries of magical jurisprudence, and her presence lent gravity to charges that challenged the fundamental assumptions of wizarding leadership. Dumbledore sat in the accused's chair with a composure that seemed almost supernatural, his long silver beard neatly arranged, and his blue eyes maintaining the twinkle that had disarmed opponents for decades. But beneath the familiar grandfatherly exterior, observers could detect signs of strain that suggested even his considerable self-control was being tested by the comprehensive nature of the accusations against him. The purple robes that had once symbolized wisdom and authority now seemed to emphasize his isolation from the community he had served for so long. The prosecution team was unlike anything the Wizengamot had seen in living memory, combining magical prosecutors with Muggle legal experts in a joint effort that reflected the new cooperative framework established in response to Harry Potter's case. Senior Prosecutor Kingsley Shacklebolt led the magical side of the case, his detailed knowledge of both communities making him uniquely qualified to present evidence that spanned 2 worlds. Detective Inspector Webb sat at the prosecution table as the senior Muggle representative, his presence in the ancient magical courtroom symbolizing the unprecedented cooperation that had emerged from the investigation. His methodical approach to evidence presentation and his refusal to be intimidated by magical tradition had earned him respect even from traditionalist members of the Wizengamot who disagreed with his conclusions. The charges against Dumbledore were extensive and damning, reflecting months of careful investigation that had revealed a pattern of decision-making that consistently prioritized strategic objectives over individual welfare. The formal accusations included child endangerment, fraud, abuse of office, conspiracy to conceal criminal activity, and violations of both magical and international law regarding the protection of minors. Kingsley rose to present the opening statement, his voice carrying the weight of evidence that had been gathered through unprecedented cooperation between magical and Muggle authorities. "Members of the Wizengamot," he began, "the evidence we will present demonstrates that Albus Dumbledore, despite his many contributions to our community, engaged in a systematic pattern of decisions that placed magical children in situations of documented abuse and neglect." The statement sent a ripple of reaction through the packed courtroom. Supporters of Dumbledore, including many who viewed him as the savior of the wizarding world during the war against Voldemort, found it difficult to reconcile these accusations with their image of the beloved headmaster and leader. But the evidence that had been compiled over months of investigation was comprehensive and impossible to dismiss. The prosecution's first major piece of evidence was the comprehensive documentation of Harry Potter's abuse at the hands of the Dursleys, presented with a level of detail that left no doubt about the severity of his mistreatment. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, testifying via magical communication from the Joint Task Force headquarters, provided medical evidence that painted a devastating picture of systematic physical and psychological abuse that had continued for 8 years. The medical records show clear evidence of malnutrition, repeated physical trauma, and psychological conditioning designed to suppress Harry Potter's magical abilities and self-worth, Dr. Chen testified, her professional composure barely containing her obvious anger at what the evidence revealed. These conditions were not the result of neglect or ignorance, but of deliberate policies implemented by people who understood exactly what they were condemning this child to endure. Dumbledore's defense team, led by the respected magical barrister Septimus Clearwater, attempted to argue that the placement had been necessary for Harry's protection from Death Eaters and other magical threats. But the prosecution systematically demolished this justification by demonstrating that alternative protective measures had been available and that the blood protection invoked to justify the placement could have been maintained through less harmful arrangements. The financial evidence presented by investigator Patricia Mills revealed the systematic nature of the conspiracy that had enabled Harry's abuse. The complex network of payments to the Dursleys, routed through shell companies and offshore accounts, demonstrated that Dumbledore had not only been aware of the family's unsuitability as guardians, but had been paying them to maintain custody of a child they clearly resented and mistreated. More damaging still was the testimony of Mrs. Arabella Figg, the squib who had been tasked with monitoring Harry's situation for nearly a decade. Her reluctant admission that she had been instructed to observe and report, but never to intervene, even when witnessing obvious signs of abuse, revealed the callous calculation that had characterized Dumbledore's approach to Harry's welfare. Professor Dumbledore specifically instructed me that Harry's suffering was necessary for his character development and magical growth, Mrs. Figg testified, her voice shaking with years of suppressed guilt and anger. He told me that a comfortable childhood would make Harry weak and unprepared for the challenges he would eventually face. The philosophy of deliberate suffering as character building struck many observers as fundamentally corrupt, representing the kind of utilitarian calculation that reduced a child to a strategic asset rather than recognizing his inherent worth and right to protection. The testimony painted Dumbledore not as a misguided protector, but as someone who had consciously chosen to sacrifice Harry's welfare for what he perceived as the greater good. The prosecution's case expanded beyond Harry Potter to encompass the broader pattern of institutional failure that the Joint Task Force had uncovered. Evidence was presented of dozens of other magical children who had been placed in unsuitable situations or abandoned to abuse because their cases were deemed less strategically important than Harry's, but were governed by the same philosophical framework that prioritized magical community interests over individual welfare. Hermione Granger's parents testified about the inadequate support and information they had received from magical authorities, describing years of isolation and confusion that could have been prevented through proper outreach and family support programs. Their testimony illustrated how Dumbledore's policies had affected not just individual children, but entire families, trying to navigate the complexities of magical Muggle integration. The international evidence presented by the Joint Task Force revealed that Dumbledore's approach to child placement was part of a broader pattern of institutional failure that extended across multiple countries and magical communities. The systematic nature of these failures suggested coordination at the highest levels of magical government, with Dumbledore serving as both architect and primary implementer of policies that consistently sacrificed individual welfare for institutional convenience. As the prosecution presented its evidence over the course of several days, the courtroom atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Traditional supporters of Dumbledore found themselves confronted with documentation that challenged their fundamental beliefs about his character and judgment, while reformist members of the Wizengamot saw vindication of concerns they had harbored for years but lacked the evidence to pursue. The defense's strategy focused on Dumbledore's contributions to magical society and his role in defeating Voldemort, arguing that his decisions regarding Harry Potter were justified by the existential threat posed by the Dark Lord. But this approach proved problematic when the prosecution demonstrated that many of the most harmful decisions had been made years before Voldemort's return, suggesting a pattern of behavior that extended beyond the specific circumstances of the war. Severus Snape's testimony proved particularly damaging to the defense, providing insider perspective on Dumbledore's decision-making process and his willingness to sacrifice individuals for strategic advantage. Snape's complex relationship with both Harry and Dumbledore lent credibility to his testimony about the headmaster's manipulative tendencies and his tendency to view people as chess pieces in a larger game. The professor consistently made decisions based on what he believed would produce the outcome he desired, Snape testified, his voice carrying the bitterness of someone who had been manipulated for years. He was willing to sacrifice anyone, including children, if he believed their suffering would serve his vision of the greater good. The most emotionally devastating moment of the trial came when Harry Potter himself testified via protected magical communication from Surrey Police Station, where he remained under the joint custody of magical and Muggle authorities. The boy's composed recounting of his experiences with the Dursleys and his growing understanding of how those experiences had been orchestrated by the man he had been taught to trust and respect created a profound silence in the courtroom. "I used to think Professor Dumbledore cared about me," Harry said, his young voice carrying pain that reached every observer in the ancient chamber. "But P.C. Whitman and Detective Inspector Webb have helped me understand that people who really care about you don't let bad things happen when they could stop them." Professor Dumbledore could have stopped the bad things, but he chose not to. The simple clarity of Harry's assessment cut through the complex legal and philosophical arguments that had characterized much of the trial. His testimony reduced the case to its fundamental moral core. An adult in a position of authority had consciously chosen to allow a child to suffer when he had the power to prevent that suffering. Dumbledore's own testimony proved to be the final nail in his defense. His attempt to justify his decisions through appeals to the greater good and the necessity of preparing Harry for his destiny revealed a philosophical framework that many observers found deeply disturbing. His apparent inability to acknowledge the harm his decisions had caused, combined with his continued insistence that Harry's suffering had been necessary and beneficial, demonstrated a level of moral detachment that shocked even his supporters. "I made the decisions I believed were necessary to protect not just Harry Potter but our entire magical community," Dumbledore testified, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who remained convinced of his righteousness despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The alternative to Harry's difficult childhood was the potential destruction of our world. The Chief Warlock's response was swift and decisive. "Professor Dumbledore," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades in magical law enforcement, your testimony demonstrates exactly why these charges were necessary. Your willingness to sacrifice a child's welfare for strategic advantage represents a fundamental corruption of the values our society claims to uphold. The Wizengamot's deliberation lasted less than 2 hours, a remarkably short time for such complex charges, but indicative of how compelling the prosecution's evidence had been. The unanimous guilty verdict on all charges sent shockwaves through magical society, representing the fall of a figure who had been considered above reproach for generations. The sentencing phase revealed the challenges of addressing crimes that had affected both magical and Muggle communities. Traditional magical punishments seemed inadequate for the scope of institutional failure that had been revealed, while Muggle legal frameworks lacked jurisdiction over purely magical aspects of the crimes. The solution reached through joint consultation established precedents for future cooperation between magical and Muggle justice systems. Dumbledore was sentenced to 25 years in Azkaban for crimes against children, with additional provisions for reparations to victims and mandatory cooperation with ongoing investigations into the international aspects of the child placement conspiracy. More significantly, he was permanently banned from any position of authority over children or educational institutions, ensuring that his philosophical approach to child welfare could never again be implemented through official channels. The immediate aftermath of the trial was chaotic, with demonstrations both supporting and opposing the verdict taking place throughout magical Britain. Traditional elements within magical society viewed the conviction as an attack on established authority and a dangerous precedent that could undermine respect for magical leadership. Progressive voices celebrated the accountability as long overdue and essential for preventing future institutional failures. International reactions were similarly divided, with some magical communities expressing concern about the precedent of joint magical Muggle prosecutions, while others began implementing similar reforms to address their own histories of institutional failure. The trial had established new standards for accountability that would influence magical jurisprudence for generations to come. For Harry Potter, watching the proceedings from his protected location in Surrey, the verdict represented validation of his experiences and confirmation that the adults now responsible for his welfare took their obligations seriously. The boy who had once believed himself to be fundamentally broken and deserving of mistreatment was beginning to understand that he had been the victim of systematic failures rather than his own inadequacies. P.C. Whitman and Detective Inspector Webb, observing the trial as representatives of the Joint Task Force, felt profound satisfaction at seeing justice served for the child whose case had initiated such sweeping reforms. Their refusal to accept easy answers or bow to institutional pressure had ultimately led to accountability at the highest levels of magical society. The trial of Albus Dumbledore marked the end of an era in magical society, representing the fall of paternalistic leadership that had prioritized institutional interests over individual welfare. In its place, new frameworks for accountability and cooperation between magical and Muggle authorities promised to ensure that no child would ever again be sacrificed for the supposed greater good. The revolution in magical Muggle relations that had begun with Harry Potter's flight from Privet Drive had achieved its first major victory, establishing precedents and principles that would guide future cooperation between communities that had maintained separation for far too long. The frightened boy who had trusted P.C. Whitman with his story had become the catalyst for changes that would protect magical children for generations to come. The newly established Joint Commission for Magical Child Welfare occupied a building that perfectly symbolized the revolutionary changes sweeping through both magical and Muggle society. Located on the border between magical London and Westminster, the converted Victorian mansion had been redesigned to accommodate the unique needs of an organization that served two previously separate worlds. The architecture itself reflected the integration taking place within its walls, with traditional magical elements like moving staircases coexisting alongside modern Muggle technology in ways that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Harry Potter walked through the Commission's halls with a confidence that would have been unimaginable during his years at Privet Drive. At 9 years old, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had survived extraordinary trauma and emerged stronger rather than broken. His physical transformation was equally remarkable, with proper nutrition and medical care having restored the healthy appearance that 8 years of neglect had stolen from him. Sirius Black walked beside Harry, his presence radiating the protective energy of someone who had fought through every legal obstacle to claim his rightful place as the boy's guardian. The months of joint magical-muggle legal proceedings that had cleared his name and established his custody rights had been exhausting but ultimately vindicating, proving that justice was possible when both communities committed to truth over convenience. The transformation in Sirius himself was profound, reflecting the healing power of purpose and responsibility after years of wrongful imprisonment. His relationship with Harry had developed naturally, despite the unusual circumstances of their reunion, built on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than the artificial bonds that Dumbledore had tried to impose through manipulation and secrecy. Dr. Elizabeth Chen greeted them in the Commission's main conference room, her role as Director of Medical Integration representing one of the most successful aspects of the new cooperative framework. Her research into magical medical phenomena had revolutionized treatment protocols for magical children, while her collaboration with St. Mungo's healers had improved outcomes for both magical and Muggle patients dealing with unexplained medical conditions. "Harry," Dr. Chen said, with the warm professionalism that had made her Harry's most trusted medical advisor, "I wanted to show you the latest statistics on the children we've been able to help through the new support programs." She activated a presentation system that seamlessly combined magical and Muggle technology, displaying data that represented hundreds of individual success stories. The numbers were impressive, but Harry had learned to focus on the personal stories behind the statistics, understanding that each data point represented a child whose life had been improved through the reforms his case had initiated. The educational transformation had been the most visible aspect of the Commission's work, with pilot programs for integrated magical Muggle schools showing remarkable success rates in preparing children to navigate both worlds effectively. The Granger Integration Academy, named in honor of Hermione's parents' advocacy work, had become the flagship institution, demonstrating how magical and Muggle education could be combined to produce more well-rounded and capable graduates. Hermione herself had become Harry's closest friend and collaborator in the youth advocacy programs that gave children a voice in the policies that affected their lives. Her brilliant analytical mind, combined with her personal experience of the challenges facing magical children from Muggle families, had made her an invaluable asset in designing support systems that actually addressed the needs of the children they were meant to serve. The friendship between Harry and Hermione had developed naturally through their shared experiences of institutional failure and their commitment to ensuring that other children received better treatment. Their partnership represented the kind of cross-cultural cooperation that the Commission hoped to foster throughout both societies, demonstrating that collaboration between different backgrounds and perspectives produced better outcomes than either community could achieve alone. PC Sarah Whitman entered the conference room, carrying a folder of case files that represented the ongoing expansion of Joint Magical Muggle Child Protection Services. Her promotion to Chief Inspector of the Magical Muggle Relations Division had been richly deserved, reflecting her pivotal role in initiating the reforms that had transformed child welfare across both communities. The transformation in Sarah herself reflected the profound changes her career had undergone since that evening when she had found Harry hiding behind cardboard boxes in a little whinging alley. Her expertise in magical Muggle cooperation had made her one of the most sought-after consultants in international law enforcement, with governments around the world seeking her guidance on implementing similar integration programs in their own jurisdictions. "Harry," Chief Inspector Whitman announced, "we have some excellent news about the expansion of joint protection services to Scotland and Wales. The pilot programs have been so successful that both regions are requesting full implementation of the integrated model. The expansion represented validation of the principles that had driven the original Surrey program, demonstrating that the cooperation between magical and Muggle authorities could be successfully replicated in different cultural and geographical contexts. The success rate for child welfare outcomes had improved dramatically wherever the integrated model had been implemented, providing compelling evidence for its continued expansion. Arthur Weasley arrived for the afternoon session with his characteristic enthusiasm barely contained, his role as Director of Muggle Magical Technology Integration having given him unprecedented opportunities to explore the intersection between magical and Muggle innovation. His work had produced breakthrough developments in everything from communication systems to medical devices, proving that collaboration between different approaches to problem-solving could yield results neither community could achieve independently. The technology integration program had particular significance for Harry, whose unique position as someone who bridged both worlds made him an ideal test case for new developments. The magical medical monitoring devices that Arthur had helped design allowed Dr. Chen to track Harry's magical development with unprecedented precision, ensuring that his abilities developed naturally without the suppression or distortion that had characterized his early years. The afternoon briefing focused on the international expansion of the Commission's work, with delegations from magical communities around the world visiting to observe the British model and adapt its principles to their own cultural contexts. The success of the joint approach to child welfare had attracted attention from organizations ranging from the International Confederation of Wizards to the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child. Minister for Magic Kingsley Shacklebolt arrived to provide updates on the broader political implications of the integration process, his elevation to the position representing the triumph of progressive voices within magical society, who had long advocated for greater cooperation with the Muggle world. His leadership had been crucial in overcoming traditionalist resistance to the reforms, while maintaining the support of moderate voices who valued stability over change. The political transformation had been as dramatic as the practical reforms, with elections throughout the magical world producing governments more committed to transparency and accountability than their predecessors. The exposure of systematic child welfare failures had created demands for broader governmental reform that extended far beyond the original scope of Harry's case. Kingsley's briefing covered the establishment of joint magical-Muggle diplomatic relations, with formal treaties recognizing the rights and responsibilities of both communities in addressing issues that affected citizens of both worlds. The legal framework that had emerged from Harry's case had evolved into a comprehensive system for managing the intersection between magical and Muggle law, ensuring that crimes affecting both communities could be properly investigated and prosecuted. Harry participated in these briefings with the engaged attention of someone who understood that his personal experiences had broader implications for institutional reform. His role as a youth advocate had given him opportunities to influence policy development, ensuring that the voice of affected children was heard in the decision-making processes that shaped their lives. The psychological healing that Harry had undergone was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of his transformation, reflecting the effectiveness of trauma-informed care that recognized both magical and Muggle approaches to mental health. The integration of magical healing techniques with Muggle therapy had produced treatment protocols that addressed the complex needs of children who had experienced abuse while developing supernatural abilities they didn't understand. Dr. Miranda Clearwater, the Commission's Director of Psychological Services, had worked closely with Harry to develop therapeutic approaches that helped magical children process trauma while learning to control and direct their abilities constructively. Her work had demonstrated that proper support could transform potentially destructive magical outbursts into focused abilities that enhanced rather than disrupted children's lives. The therapeutic model had been particularly effective for Harry, whose uncontrolled magical incidents had virtually disappeared as his emotional healing progressed and his understanding of his abilities improved. The electricity-disrupting episodes that had once terrified him had evolved into precise control over electronic systems that he could use to help other children in crisis situations. The Commission's youth advocacy program had become Harry's primary focus, giving him opportunities to work directly with children who were experiencing situations similar to his own earlier trauma. His ability to connect with frightened or angry children, combined with his first-hand understanding of institutional failure, had made him remarkably effective at helping other young people navigate the complex systems designed to protect them. The work was emotionally challenging, but deeply rewarding, allowing Harry to transform his own painful experiences into tools for helping others. Each child he was able to reach represented a victory over the systems that had failed him, demonstrating that individual trauma could be converted into collective healing when supported by properly designed institutional frameworks. Hermione's contributions to the advocacy program focused on policy analysis and systemic reform, her exceptional analytical abilities having identified patterns and gaps in services that adult administrators had missed. Her research into the long-term outcomes for children in various placement situations had influenced policy development throughout the integrated system, ensuring that decisions were based on evidence rather than tradition or convenience. The partnership between Harry and Hermione in advocacy work represented the kind of collaboration the Commission hoped to foster throughout both societies, demonstrating that different strengths and perspectives could be combined to achieve better outcomes than either individual could accomplish alone. Their friendship had become a model for the kind of relationships the integrated educational programs were designed to promote. The evening session concluded with presentations from the first graduating class of the integrated education program, young people who had spent their formative years learning to navigate both magical and Muggle worlds with confidence and competence. Their achievements provided compelling evidence that the educational reforms were producing graduates better prepared for the complexities of modern life than either traditional magical or Muggle education could achieve independently. Harry watched these presentations with the satisfaction of someone whose suffering had ultimately produced positive changes that would benefit future generations. The children presenting their projects had grown up in systems designed to support rather than suppress their development, receiving the kind of guidance and encouragement that Harry had been denied during his own childhood. The contrast between these confident, well-adjusted young people and Harry's own traumatic early experiences highlighted the importance of the institutional reforms that had emerged from his case. The Commission's work had demonstrated that systematic abuse could be prevented through properly designed support systems and accountability mechanisms that prioritized individual welfare over institutional convenience. As the day concluded, Harry reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him from the cupboard under the stairs to a position of influence in shaping policies that would protect magical children for generations to come. His transformation from victim to advocate represented the best possible outcome from a situation that had begun with such darkness and despair. Sirius joined Harry for the walk home to their comfortable flat near the Commission headquarters, their conversation focusing on plans for expanding the youth advocacy programs to reach even more children in need of support. The relationship between guardian and ward had evolved into something approaching equality, with Sirius recognizing Harry's exceptional maturity and insight, while still providing the stability and protection every child deserved. The evening routine they had established represented the kind of normal family life that Harry had never experienced during his years with the Dursleys. Simple activities like preparing dinner together, discussing the day's events, and planning weekend activities had profound significance for someone whose childhood had been marked by isolation and fear rather than connection and security. Dr. Chen's final report of the day had included updates on the dozens of other children whose lives had been transformed through the Commission's work, each success story representing validation of the principles that had guided the reforms from the beginning. The systematic approach to identifying and supporting vulnerable magical children had prevented countless cases of abuse and neglect, demonstrating that institutional change could be both practical and effective when properly implemented. The international recognition that the British model had received was particularly gratifying, with delegations from magical communities around the world visiting to learn from the Commission's experiences and adapt its approaches to their own cultural contexts. The success of the integrated model had inspired similar reforms in countries throughout Europe and North America, suggesting that the changes initiated by Harry's case would have global impact. Chief Inspector Whitman's closing briefing had highlighted the dramatic improvements in child welfare outcomes that had been achieved through the joint magical-muggle approach, with statistics showing significant reductions in abuse cases and improvements in educational and psychological outcomes for children in the integrated support systems. The evidence base for the effectiveness of the cooperative model had become so compelling that opposition voices had largely been silenced by the undeniable success of the programs. As Harry prepared for bed in the safe, comfortable home that Sirius had created for them, he felt profound gratitude for the adults who had fought for his welfare when he had no voice to advocate for himself. P.C. Whitman's refusal to ignore a frightened child, Detective Inspector Webb's determination to pursue justice regardless of obstacles, and Dr. Chen's commitment to providing proper medical care had combined to create the foundation for changes that extended far beyond his individual case. The revolution in magical-muggle relations that had begun with Harry's desperate flight from Privet Drive had achieved its fundamental objectives, establishing new frameworks for cooperation that ensured no child would ever again be sacrificed for institutional convenience or traditional prejudice. The frightened boy who had trusted P.C. Whitman with his story had become the catalyst for changes that would protect and nurture magical children for generations to come. The transformation was complete, not just in Harry's individual circumstances, but in the broader relationship between magical and Muggle society. The institutions that had failed so dramatically had been rebuilt on foundations of accountability, transparency, and genuine commitment to child welfare, ensuring that the mistakes of the past could never be repeated on such a systematic scale. The Grand Courtroom of the Old Bailey had hosted many historic trials throughout its distinguished history, but the proceedings against Vernon and Petunia Dursley represented something entirely unprecedented in British legal history. The convergence of magical and Muggle justice systems in a single prosecution had attracted international attention from legal scholars, child welfare advocates, and governmental officials who recognized that the case would establish precedents for addressing crimes that affected both communities. Harry Potter sat in the witness protection area, now 11 years old and bearing little resemblance to the terrified child who had fled Privet Drive nearly 3 years earlier. His transformation was profound, reflecting not just physical recovery from years of abuse, but the psychological healing that came from being believed, protected, and empowered to help other children facing similar situations. The composed young man who would testify about his experiences bore witness to the effectiveness of the integrated support systems that had emerged from his case. Judge Patricia Hendricks presided over the proceedings with the authority of someone who had spent decades handling complex criminal cases, though nothing in her extensive experience had prepared her for the unique challenges of a trial that involved both magical and Muggle evidence. The legal framework that had been developed specifically for such cases represented a revolutionary approach to international cooperation in criminal justice, establishing procedures that other countries were already adapting for their own use. The prosecution team was led by Crown Prosecutor Margaret Sterling, whose reputation for meticulous preparation and passionate advocacy for victim rights had made her the natural choice for such a significant case. Working alongside her was Senior Magical Prosecutor Diana Clearwater, whose expertise in magical law provided the specialized knowledge necessary to present evidence that spanned both legal systems. The defense of the Dursleys had proven problematic for the legal community, with several prominent barristers declining to represent clients whose actions had been so thoroughly documented and whose cases had attracted such overwhelming public attention. The eventual defense team, led by QC Robert Thornfield, faced the unenviable task of defending the indefensible while maintaining professional standards and ethical obligations. Vernon Dursley sat in the dock with the deflated appearance of a man whose carefully constructed facade of respectability had been systematically demolished through years of investigation and public exposure. The massive frame that had once intimidated a small boy now seemed diminished, reflecting the psychological collapse that had accompanied the legal proceedings. His face bore the expression of someone who could no longer deny the evidence of his own cruelty, but remained incapable of accepting responsibility for the consequences. Petunia Dursley occupied the adjacent seat with the bitter resentment of someone who had convinced herself that her actions were justified by circumstances beyond her control. Her thin frame appeared even more fragile than usual, but her expression retained the sharp-edged hostility that had characterized her treatment of Harry throughout his childhood. Unlike her husband, she seemed determined to maintain her innocence, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The charges against both defendants were extensive and severe, reflecting the comprehensive nature of the abuse they had inflicted over 8 years. The formal accusations included child abuse, child endangerment, fraud, conspiracy to conceal criminal activity, and violations of international treaties regarding the protection of children. The magical components of the charges added additional complexity, involving crimes against a magical person and conspiracy to suppress magical abilities. Prosecutor Sterling opened the case with a statement that laid out the systematic nature of the abuse, while emphasizing the broader implications of the defendant's actions for child protection across both communities. "Members of the jury," she began, "the evidence you will hear in this case documents not just the abuse of a single child, but a conspiracy that enabled systematic mistreatment while preventing the intervention that could have protected Harry Potter from years of unnecessary suffering." The opening statement was followed by the presentation of medical evidence that Dr. Elizabeth Chen had compiled over months of careful documentation. Her testimony provided a clinical but devastating account of the physical and psychological damage that 8 years of abuse had inflicted on Harry, while also highlighting the remarkable recovery that proper care and support had made possible. The medical records show clear evidence of chronic malnutrition, repeated physical trauma, and psychological conditioning designed to suppress both Harry's magical abilities and his sense of self-worth. Dr. Chen testified, her professional composure barely containing her obvious anger at the documented evidence of systematic cruelty. These injuries were not the result of accidents or discipline, but of deliberate policies designed to break a child's spirit and render him compliant through fear and suffering. The prosecution's case was strengthened by the testimony of neighbors who had witnessed years of abuse but had failed to report it to authorities. Mrs. Henderson's reluctant admission that she had heard Harry crying for hours at a time, combined with her description of seeing him forced to perform dangerous household tasks, provided corroborating evidence for the medical documentation of his mistreatment. The financial evidence presented by senior investigator Patricia Mills revealed the monetary incentives that had motivated the Dursleys to maintain custody of a child they clearly resented and feared. The complex network of payments that had supported their comfortable lifestyle in exchange for keeping Harry isolated from the magical world demonstrated the calculated nature of their participation in his abuse. The Dursleys received payments equivalent to £40,000 annually for maintaining custody of Harry Potter, Mills testified, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who had traced every transaction through multiple financial systems. These payments were structured to increase when Harry displayed signs of distress or behavioral problems, creating financial incentives for harsh treatment rather than proper care. The most emotionally powerful testimony came from Harry himself, whose composed recounting of his experiences provided the jury with first-hand insight into the systematic nature of his mistreatment. His ability to describe specific incidents while maintaining emotional control demonstrated the effectiveness of the trauma therapy he had received, while his clear articulation of how the abuse had affected his development provided crucial context for understanding the long-term damage the Dursleys had inflicted. "They told me every day that I was worthless, that my parents had been drunks and criminals, and that I was lucky they were willing to keep me at all," Harry testified, his young voice carrying the weight of someone who had survived experiences no child should endure. "When strange things happened around me, Uncle Vernon would lock me in the cupboard for days without food, and Aunt Petunia would tell me that I was a freak who deserved whatever happened to me. The testimony was particularly damaging because Harry's calm delivery and obvious intelligence contradicted any suggestion that he had been a difficult or unmanageable child who had somehow provoked the abuse through his behavior. His description of being forced to cook elaborate meals while being denied adequate food himself painted a picture of calculated cruelty that was impossible to justify through any rationalization about discipline or difficult circumstances. The defense strategy focused on attempting to portray the Dursleys as unwilling victims of circumstances beyond their control, arguing that they had been forced to care for a child with dangerous and unpredictable abilities while receiving inadequate support from the authorities who had placed him with them. The approach proved problematic when the prosecution demonstrated that the Dursleys had actively sought to suppress Harry's abilities through abuse rather than seeking proper assistance in managing them. Q.C. Thornfield's cross-examination of Harry attempted to suggest that the boy's memories might have been distorted by trauma or influenced by the adults who had cared for him since his rescue. The strategy backfired when Harry calmly provided specific details about incidents of abuse, including dates, times, and circumstances that were corroborated by medical records and neighbor testimony. "I remember everything very clearly," Harry responded when questioned about the reliability of his recollections. "Dr. Clearwater says that sometimes people with magical abilities have enhanced memory, especially about traumatic events. I wish I couldn't remember as much as I do, but the memories are very clear and accurate." The revelation that Harry's magical abilities might include enhanced memory capabilities added another dimension to the case, providing additional credibility to his testimony while highlighting the unique challenges faced by magical children in Muggle households. The information also raised questions about how many other magical children might possess similar capabilities that had been suppressed or ignored by caregivers who didn't understand their significance. Severus Snape's testimony provided crucial context about the broader conspiracy that had enabled Harry's abuse, describing the institutional failures within the magical community that had prioritized secrecy over child welfare. His complex relationship with Harry's parents and his role in the events leading to Harry's placement with the Dursleys lent credibility to his account of how the decision had been made and implemented. The placement was presented as temporary protection that would last only until alternative arrangements could be made, Snape testified, his voice carrying the bitter certainty of someone who had been manipulated by more powerful figures. Instead, it became a permanent abandonment that condemned Harry to years of abuse, while the magical community deliberately ignored evidence of his mistreatment. Arthur Weasley testified about the magical monitoring systems that could have been used to track Harry's welfare during his time with the Dursleys, demonstrating that the technology existed to prevent the abuse, but had been deliberately not employed. His testimony revealed that the magical authorities had possessed both the means and the obligation to ensure Harry's safety, but had consciously chosen not to use them. The prosecution's case was further strengthened by testimony from other families who had cared for magical children, demonstrating that abuse was not an inevitable consequence of such placements when proper support and oversight were provided. The contrast between Harry's experiences and those of magical children who had been placed with caring families highlighted the preventable nature of his suffering. Chief Inspector Sarah Whitman testified about the investigation that had uncovered the conspiracy surrounding Harry's placement, describing how the initial child abuse case had evolved into a comprehensive review of institutional failures affecting both magical and Muggle communities. Her account of the resistance she had encountered from various authorities provided insight into the systematic nature of the cover-up that had enabled Harry's abuse to continue unchecked. The most significant challenge to the defense came when Vernon Dursley took the stand in his own defense, his testimony revealing the depth of his hatred for anything magical and his complete lack of remorse for the abuse he had inflicted. His attempt to justify his actions through claims that Harry had been dangerous and uncontrollable was systematically demolished by evidence showing that the boy had been a victim rather than a threat. "The freak brought nothing but trouble from the moment he arrived," Vernon testified, his voice carrying the same venom that had characterized his treatment of Harry throughout the boy's childhood. "We did our best with an impossible situation, but he was always causing problems with his unnatural abilities." The use of derogatory language to describe Harry, even during formal legal proceedings, provided stark evidence of Vernon's continued inability to recognize Harry's humanity or acknowledge the harm his treatment had caused. The testimony actually strengthened the prosecution's case by demonstrating the mindset that had enabled years of systematic abuse. Petunia Dursley's testimony proved equally damaging to the defense, revealing her deep-seated resentment of her sister's magical abilities and her determination to prevent Harry from developing similar powers. Her admission that she had known Harry was being abused but had considered it necessary to suppress his magical nature provided clear evidence of premeditation and conscious participation in his mistreatment. "He was my sister's son, but he represented everything about her world that I hated and feared," Petunia testified, her voice carrying decades of accumulated bitterness. "I thought if we were strict enough, we could make him normal, make the freakishness go away." The psychological evaluation that had been conducted on both defendants revealed disturbing patterns of thinking that helped explain but could not excuse their treatment of Harry. The reports documented deep-seated prejudices, inability to empathize with their victim, and complete lack of insight into the harm their actions had caused. The closing arguments provided both prosecution and defense with opportunities to present their final interpretations of the evidence, though the overwhelming nature of the case against the Dursleys made the defense position extremely difficult to maintain. Prosecutor Sterling's summation emphasized the systematic nature of the abuse and its preventable character, arguing that the defendants deserved severe punishment, not just for their direct actions, but for their participation in a conspiracy that had enabled institutional failures. The jury deliberation lasted less than 4 hours, reflecting the overwhelming nature of the evidence and the clarity of the defendants' guilt. The unanimous conviction on all charges sent a clear message that child abuse would not be tolerated, regardless of the circumstances surrounding the placement or the unusual nature of the child's abilities. The sentencing phase revealed the complexity of addressing crimes that had affected both magical and Muggle communities, while establishing precedents for future cooperation between justice systems. Judge Hendricks imposed sentences that reflected both the severity of the crimes and the need to send a clear deterrent message to others who might consider similar actions. Vernon Dursley was sentenced to 15 years in prison for child abuse and related charges, with additional provisions for restitution to Harry and mandatory participation in programs designed to address his prejudicial attitudes toward magical people. Petunia Dursley received 12 years, with recognition of her cooperation in certain aspects of the investigation, but no mitigation for the systematic nature of her participation in Harry's abuse. The international attention that the trial had attracted resulted in similar prosecutions being initiated in other countries where magical children had been placed in unsuitable situations, demonstrating that the precedents established by Harry's case would have global implications for child protection across both communities. Dudley Dursley, who had been placed in a specialized rehabilitation program designed to address the effects of his upbringing, provided a statement expressing remorse for his participation in Harry's mistreatment and support for the reforms that had emerged from the case. His transformation demonstrated that even children raised in prejudiced and abusive environments could learn to recognize and reject harmful attitudes when provided with proper guidance and support. For Harry, watching the conclusion of the legal proceedings that had begun with his desperate flight from Privet Drive, the convictions represented validation of his experiences and confirmation that the adults now responsible for his welfare would not allow such systematic failures to occur again. The frightened boy who had hidden behind cardboard boxes had become the catalyst for changes that would protect magical children throughout both communities. The revolution in child protection that had begun with P.C. Whitman's refusal to ignore a child in need had achieved its fundamental objectives, establishing accountability for those who had participated in systematic abuse, while creating new frameworks that would prevent similar failures in the future. The trial of the Dursleys marked the end of an era when magical children could be abandoned to abuse with impunity, ensuring that Harry Potter's suffering would be the last of its kind. As Harry left the courthouse, surrounded by the adults who had fought for his welfare and protection, he carried with him the knowledge that his experiences, however painful, had ultimately produced changes that would benefit countless other children facing similar challenges. The boy who had once believed himself to be fundamentally broken and deserving of mistreatment had become the symbol of institutional reform and the catalyst for unprecedented cooperation between communities that had maintained separation for far too long.